Neanderthals were absolute freaks of nature. You are in a forest, but not the kind you know. No chirping birds, no neatly packed soil underfoot. The trees are taller, the wind sharper. You're standing somewhere in Ice Age Europe about 70,000 years ago. To the east lies a glacier, endless and white. To the west, tundra melts into forest, damp and creaking. You're here because you're trying to understand a people who were not exactly human, but were far from animal. They were Neanderthals, and they didn't just grunt and club things. They were doing something much more impressive. Surviving. For nearly 300,000 years, Neanderthals existed in some of the harshest climates Earth has ever offered. They hunted animals twice their size, crafted tools from flint and bone, and passed down knowledge from one generation to the next. They didn't invent the wheel or write epic poems, but they didn't need to. Their genius lay in something far quieter: adaptation. First, we should confront the myth. When Neanderthal bones were first discovered in the Neander Valley in 1856, scientists didn't know what to make of them. The initial reaction was brute. With sloping foreheads and massive brow ridges, the skeletons didn't fit the upright, divine image that Victorian thinkers like to associate with humanity. It didn't help that the first skeleton studied, an elderly male, had arthritis and fused joints, giving him a hunched, ape-like appearance. The name stuck. Neanderthals became the shorthand for anything uncivilized, unthinking, or savage. But the truth is far more complex. Neanderthals had brains larger than yours. Not figuratively, literally. The average Neanderthal cranial capacity was around 1,450 to 1,600 cubic centimeters, slightly larger than modern Homo sapiens. Of course, size isn't everything. What matters more is how that brain was used. Let's walk through a Neanderthal camp. It's a cold evening. You'd expect chaos, perhaps a fire pit and bodies huddled for warmth. But what you see is astonishingly organized. There's a designated place for working with animal hides, a place where someone is knapping flint, and yet another spot where meat is being smoked over a slow fire. These zones aren't randomly distributed. They show an understanding of task, separation, perhaps even sanitation and food safety. It's not a city, but it's a system. And that system allowed Neanderthals to endure some of the most extreme conditions in human history. They needed to be physically exceptional to make it through the Ice Age. Neanderthals were short and stocky, usually about 5'5", but built like linebackers. Broad chests, barrel-shaped rib cages, and thick bones meant they retained heat efficiently. Their noses, wide and projecting, likely helped warm cold air before it hit the lungs. In evolutionary terms, they were the SUV of humans. Not fast, not elegant, but built to take a beating. Their environment demanded ingenuity. The Ice Age wasn't just cold, it was inconsistent. Glacial and interglacial periods came and went, shifting the availability of animals and plant life. Neanderthals adapted by developing a toolkit. These weren't simple rocks. They made what archaeologists call the Mousterian toolkit. Flint points, scrapers, awls, and even hafted tools. Stone tips mounted onto wooden shafts with natural glues like birch bark resin. Making birch tar, by the way, required heating bark. In an oxygen-poor environment, basically an early chemical process. They hunted cooperatively. A single man could not take down a woolly rhinoceros or a megaloceros, giant elk with 12-foot antlers. But a group of Neanderthals working together, ambushing, flanking, anticipating an animal's movements could. Their injuries, when examined in fossil records, mirror those of modern rodeo professionals. Broken bones, smashed ribs, signs of close-range trauma. This suggests their hunting style was up close and personal, not from a distance. You had to get near enough to stab a beast through the ribs, and then you had to live long enough to recover. And when one of them didn't recover fully, that's where the most human part of the Neanderthal story comes in. Evidence from Shanidar Cave in modern-day Iraq tells us about a Neanderthal who lived with a crushed eye socket, a withered arm, and a deformed leg. He couldn't have hunted. He probably couldn't even walk. But he lived well into his 40s, ancient by Ice Age standards. This suggests he was cared for, fed, protected, and not discarded when he became a burden. Neanderthals had culture too, though it didn't leave behind songs or sculptures on the scale of Homo sapiens. But they did decorate. Perforated shells, with traces of ochre pigment, suggest they wore ornaments. Caves in Spain show red-painted stalagmites dated to over 65,000 years ago, before Homo sapiens ever arrived there. They buried their dead, sometimes with flowers or animal bones. And in a cave in Bruniquel, France, researchers found rings of broken stalagmites, arranged purposefully in the dark, some 176,000 years ago. No one knows exactly what they were for: ritual, shelter, art, but they weren't random. Communication? They had that too. Their hyoid bone, a horseshoe-shaped bone in the throat crucial for speech, is nearly identical to ours. They also possessed the FOXP2 gene, which is involved in language. While we don't know what their language sounded like, it's safe to assume they weren't silent. As you sit near the Neanderthal hearth, watching the flicker of a fire across a rock wall, it's hard not to feel their presence as both alien and deeply familiar. Their tools, their communities, their burial practices, they all suggest a being capable of thought, emotion, memory. They had no empires, no written records. But for nearly 300,000 years they adapted, survived, and even flourished in a world most of us couldn't last a week in. And yet, they vanished. Around 40,000 years ago, Neanderthals disappeared from the fossil record. Not with a bang. There is no evidence of genocide or war, just a slow fading like the last coals of a dying fire. The question is why? You wake again, this time on a chilly steppe some 39,000 years ago. The trees have thinned, the air feels lighter, and the winds carry a different kind of sound. The laughter of children, the crack of firewood, the rhythmic pounding of stone on stone. You're still with the Neanderthals, but not for much longer. This is the twilight of their world, and something has changed. The Neanderthals don't know it, but their days are numbered. The Homo sapiens have arrived. We often imagine history as a sequence of conquests, with one group wiping out another in a clean sweep. But the relationship between Neanderthals and Homo sapiens is murkier than that. Genetic evidence now shows that when modern humans migrated into Europe and Asia from Africa, starting around 45,000 years ago, they didn't just compete with Neanderthals, they mated with them. You likely carry Neanderthal DNA in your body right now, particularly if your ancestry traces to Europe or Asia. Between 1% and 4% of your genome may be theirs. So what happened to them? Why did Neanderthals, those stocky masters of the Ice Age, disappear while our ancestors thrived? Let's first examine the environment again. The Ice Age was not a static climate. There were abrupt temperature fluctuations, some of them extreme. One such event, the Heinrich Event 4, occurred around 40,000 years ago and may have dramatically cooled Europe over just a few decades. Cold the Neanderthals could manage. But unpredictable cold? That could disrupt food supplies, migration patterns, even birth rates. A warming event could be just as dangerous. Animals once accustomed to frigid tundras moved northward. Forests shifted. Rivers changed course. With every environmental change came a new survival equation, and not everyone could solve it in time. Neanderthals, who had perfected life in cold, stable climates, may have struggled to adapt to rapid variability. Then came competition. Homo sapiens were not necessarily stronger than Neanderthals, but they were almost certainly more versatile. Their tools were more diverse, ranging from barbed points to composite tools to fishhooks. They worked with bone, antler, and ivory. Neanderthals stuck largely to stone. That's not to say Neanderthals couldn't innovate, but they did so more slowly, and their population sizes were smaller. Innovation, after all, thrives in larger communities where ideas can bounce around. And it wasn't just tools. Homo sapiens had art, real, deep art. They painted caves with images of horses and hands and abstract symbols. They carved figurines. They told stories. Some researchers believe that this kind of symbolic behavior, myth, identity, ritual, helped Homo sapiens build stronger social bonds, larger kinship networks, and more adaptable societies. They may have been better at sharing food, organizing hunts, or caring for the vulnerable. These advantages are invisible in fossils, but they echo in how humans took over the world. There's also the matter of childbearing. Neanderthals matured faster than Homo sapiens. They had shorter childhoods, which meant less time for learning and social development. Human children, by contrast, are helpless for years, something that seems inefficient, but actually enables longer, deeper learning and tighter emotional bonds within communities. The human family unit may have been more resilient in the long term. Still, it wasn't war that undid the Neanderthals. There's no widespread evidence of violent conflict between species. In fact, as mentioned earlier, we mated with them. DNA studies show that interbreeding happened several times and in different regions. Some of this was likely consensual, some may not have been, but whatever the social dynamics, the genetic legacy remains. Your immune system, for example, owes some of its strength to Neanderthal genes, specifically in recognizing pathogens like bacteria and viruses. On the flip side, Neanderthal DNA has been linked to conditions like type 2 diabetes, lupus, and even nicotine addiction. So maybe it wasn't extinction in the traditional sense. Maybe it was absorption. But there is another possibility, one more tragic and more intimate. Imagine a Neanderthal group living in a mountain valley. Their numbers are low. A harsh winter comes. An old woman dies. Then a child. A few years. Later, a storm wipes out a hunting party. The group shrinks further. They join another band miles away. But that group has already begun mingling with Homo sapiens, who have different customs, different ways of speaking, perhaps more resources, or more allies. Over time, the cultural identity of the Neanderthal dissolves. A generation passes. No one remembers the rituals, the songs, the ways of tool-making. Their bones are still buried in the soil, but their world has ended, not with murder, but with forgetting. Archaeologists have found fewer and fewer Neanderthal tools in layers dated after 40,000 years ago. Their presence thins, then stops. Some last outposts, like the cave site of Gorham's Cave in Gibraltar, suggest they may have held on in isolated regions until about 32,000 years ago. But by then, they were ghosts on the margins. What makes this all the more unsettling is how little they left behind in terms of explanation. No final carving, no last symbol. Just a silence in the fossil record where a people once thrived. And yet their legacy endures, not just in your blood, but in your breath, your body, your memory of them now. They taught us that intelligence is not always loud, that survival can be quiet. That culture doesn't need cities or kings. Still, one question remains unanswered. If they were smart, strong, adaptable, and even capable of love, why didn't they write the story of the world instead of us? It is quiet now. So quiet you can almost hear the absence. The Neanderthals are gone. The last embers of their hearths have long since gone cold. No footprints in the mud, no tools, freshly abandoned. Just layers of soil, of sediment, of time. And yet they are not gone. They are still here, in a way that no one in their own time could have guessed. They survive not in their own voice, but in yours. Let's begin with the scientific evidence that first told us Neanderthals weren't entirely lost. In 2010, a draft of the Neanderthal genome was published by the Max Planck Institute. Extracted painstakingly from bones that had been buried for tens of thousands of years, it revealed something remarkable. Homo sapiens and Neanderthals had interbred, not once, not accidentally, but repeatedly, across thousands of years and thousands of miles. At least some Neanderthals had not been replaced. They had been folded into us. This changed everything. What had once been a clean line, Homo sapiens emerging, Neanderthals vanishing, was now a tangled braid. It turned out that our story was not separate from theirs. We were not merely the winners of evolutionary roulette. We were their relatives, their neighbors, and in many cases, their partners. That genetic inheritance is not abstract. It shapes parts of your body and mind in ways scientists are still working to understand. Certain Neanderthal genes influence the way your immune system responds to pathogens. Some influence skin pigmentation and hair color, useful adaptations for living in low-light northern environments. Others appear tied to modern conditions like celiac disease, depression, and even circadian rhythm sensitivity. You may sleep the way you do, light or heavy, early or late, because a Neanderthal ancestor once hunted under a different moon. And yet the transmission wasn't perfect. Neanderthal DNA is found in uneven patches across our genome. Some parts of the human genetic code, especially those tied to male fertility, are almost completely free of Neanderthal input. This suggests that hybrid male offspring may have been less fertile, or that their genes were gradually purged by natural selection. In essence, the merging of the species was incomplete. We are kin but not entirely alike. But genetics is only part of the legacy. What about memory, culture, language? These are harder to trace, yet tantalizing clues remain. Did Homo sapiens adopt Neanderthal hunting strategies? Did we learn new uses for stone or bone from our archaic cousins? It's not impossible. In regions where both species coexisted, there is archaeological evidence that some tools became more similar. Neanderthals began to show signs of blade technology previously associated with Homo sapiens. Whether this was cultural exchange, parallel invention, or imitation is still debated. But the proximity mattered. In truth, Neanderthals may have influenced our very sense of what it means to be human. For thousands of years, we were not alone. We lived beside another species with minds, needs, and thoughts of their own, and then slowly they were gone. That loss, whether acknowledged or not, may have shaped us deeply. It may have driven Homo sapiens to expand, to colonize, to fill the empty spaces with meaning, memory, and myth. There's a curious phenomenon in human storytelling, the idea of the other, the silent, shadowed being who resembles us but does not belong. Trolls, giants, wild men of the woods, forest spirits. These figures appear across cultures, especially in regions once inhabited by Neanderthals. Some anthropologists speculate that such myths may be distant echoes of a real memory, passed down through oral traditions, the memory of another kind of human. Not quite us, not entirely different, just gone. You can almost imagine the stories being told around fires long after the last Neanderthal vanished. There used to be another people in these lands, someone might say. They were strong, but strange. They buried their dead, but spoke few words. They knew the animals better than we do. And maybe a child asked, where did they go? We ask the same question today. And while science has answered much of it, climate, competition, absorption, there's still something unknowable at the core. What was it like to be the last Neanderthal? To look across the valley and see another kind of human growing more numerous, more confident, speaking in a language you did not fully understand? Perhaps it was lonely. Or perhaps not. Perhaps those final bands of Neanderthals found comfort in shared fires, in mixed families, in children whose genes carried both legacies. Today, every step we take into the past reveals new contradictions. The Neanderthals were not primitive. They were not failed experiments. They were survivors, tenacious, intelligent, adaptable. They endured longer than our own recorded history has yet lasted. And in the end, they did not disappear completely. They became part of us. The next time you stand in a forest and feel the wind cold against your skin, remember this, that your body knows things your mind has forgotten, that your breath, your bones, your very blood hold the echoes of a people who once shaped flint beneath a glacier sky. They didn't write history, but they are written into it. And yet one thought lingers. If Neanderthals had somehow outlasted us, if they had been the ones to settle the globe, would they have done it better? How Roman roads were maintained and more. You are walking along a road. Though walking may be too generous a term, you are bumping, slipping, jostling your way forward. It's early morning in the Roman Empire, somewhere near the border of Gaul and Hispania, and the road beneath your feet is not quite as smooth as you imagined it might be. It's rutted from carts, cracked in places, and not entirely dry after last week's rain. And yet for the time period it's nothing short of miraculous. Roman roads are famous. They appear in textbooks, tourist brochures, and travel documentaries as symbols of ancient engineering brilliance. But we rarely consider what happened after they were built. The hard part wasn't just laying the stones, it was maintaining them day after day, year after year, for centuries. That part, the slow decay and slower repair of thousands of miles of infrastructure, is what kept Rome functioning, and it's where the real work of empire often occurred. Let's begin with the scope. At its height, the Roman Empire managed an astonishing 250,000 miles of roads, of which more than 50,000 miles were stone-paved. These were not casual paths, but formal engineered arteries stretching from Britain to Egypt, from the Atlantic to the Euphrates. They carried more than armies. They moved tax collectors, wine shipments, diplomatic letters, criminals in chains, pilgrims to shrines, and grain convoys to the cities. The roads were Rome's nervous system, but what kept this vast network functioning? The answer lies in the dry, mostly invisible world of imperial maintenance, a world filled with surveyors, road wardens, local laborers, forced conscripts, enslaved, people, and a constant stream of small repairs made by hands whose names we never learn. Road maintenance in the Roman Empire was not centralized, at least not in the way we might imagine today. The imperial government didn't send out a nationwide road crew in uniform. Instead, road upkeep was the shared responsibility of various local officials, landowners, and civic bodies. In many provinces, roads were maintained by curatores viarum, officials appointed to oversee road quality in a given region. These men were often wealthy members of the local elite, expected to fund repairs out of their own pockets or raise local funds to do so. Sometimes entire communities were required by law to contribute labor or money for road upkeep. This was seen not just as a civic duty, but as a form of taxation in kind. The emperor might decree that a certain stretch of road near a town was to be fixed, and the town would have to comply, supplying stones, oxen, carts, and manpower. It wasn't glamorous work. Much of it fell to local peasants, or worse, to convicts and enslaved people whose labor was considered expendable. But without them, Rome would have ground to a halt. The work itself was never-ending. The Roman road system used layers of gravel, sand, and large flat stones, often underpinned by a trench filled with broken rock for drainage. Over time, water eroded the foundations, frost cracked the stones, vegetation crept in from the shoulders. Ox-drawn carts created deep ruts in the stone surfaces, some of which are still visible today. Rainwater, poorly drained, turned sections of road into pits of sticky mud or eroded channels. So, who fixed this mess? Sometimes, the same soldiers who had once built the roads were assigned to maintain them. Military engineers, architecti, trained in surveying and construction, were often involved in laying out or restoring key roads near forts and outposts. They used tools like the groma to keep lines straight and measured distances with hodometers, ancient cart-mounted odometers that dropped a pebble into a jar for every Roman mile traveled. More often, however, local civilians and enslaved laborers did the tedious, repetitive work, patching potholes with crushed stone, replacing cracked slabs, digging ditches alongside the roads to ensure better drainage. In wealthier areas, way stations or manchones, government run-ins for travelers, kept workers nearby who were responsible for minor road maintenance, particularly after heavy storms. And then there was the question of funding. Emperors sometimes financed major road repairs through imperial treasury funds, especially for roads of strategic military value. But for most secondary roads, the burden fell on provincial governors or local magistrates. Wealthy individuals often gained prestige by gifting new roads or repairs to their cities, a practice known as eurgetism, the elite's way of buying respect by sponsoring public works. These benefactors sometimes left inscriptions carved into stone mile markers, miliaria, commemorating their gift to future travelers. Marcus Lucius built this road at his own expense from mile 12 to 20, one such marker might read. It was a subtle form of advertisement, a boast disguised as civic virtue. Even the emperor got involved. Augustus, the first emperor, famously claimed that he found Rome a city of brick and left it a city of marble, a statement that applies just as much to infrastructure. He took special pride in organizing the cursus publicus, the imperial postal and transportation network, which depended entirely on reliable roads. Later emperors such as Hadrian and Trajan launched massive road repair campaigns, aware that no army, no tax collection, and no news could move faster than the road would allow. And yet, even the best-maintained roads were only as good as the people who walked them. Travelers encountered worn cobbles, collapsed bridges, weeds growing between stones. Bandits lay in wait along poorly monitored stretches. In mountainous regions, rains could wash away entire sections of road in one season. In North Africa, sandstorms slowly buried roads in layers of desert dust. In Gaul, overgrown woods reclaimed abandoned routes. Maintenance was relentless, but decay equally so. Still, the roads endured. By late afternoon, as the sun slants low across the hills, you pass a road crew at work. 4 men with chisels, 1 cart loaded with gravel, a donkey with no interest, in your presence. They move slowly. The stones are heavy and the day is long. They are not remembered in marble inscriptions or triumphal arches. Yet every step of your journey rests on their work. And as you continue walking past fields, villas, way stations, and border markers, you might wonder, how much of an empire's power rests not on its conquests, but on the quiet, back-breaking work of keeping a road from falling apart? You've walked nearly 10 miles by now. The road has shifted beneath your feet from flat stone to gravel, then back again. Here in the countryside, it's easy to forget you're moving along the hardened veins of empire. The wind carries the scent of crushed thyme and manure. The sun glints off a distant aqueduct, and somewhere behind a row of cypresses, you can hear the rhythmic chink of iron striking stone. More maintenance. It's tempting to imagine Roman infrastructure as the work of a few extraordinary engineers, men like Vitruvius, who left behind precise treatises on construction and design. But in reality, most Roman roads were kept alive by a sprawling, underpaid, and often invisible bureaucracy. This bureaucracy is what makes the Roman road system so uniquely durable. Not just the engineering, but the social machinery humming quietly behind it. You've already met the curatores viarum, the officials charged with overseeing road upkeep in a particular region. These were not typically engineers themselves, but politicians or wealthy landowners entrusted with responsibility, and often a modest imperial stipend, to ensure that roads in their jurisdiction didn't fall into disrepair. Some curatores were attentive, others predictably were negligent or corrupt. In Italy and the western provinces, curatores often worked with magistrates from nearby towns, especially in municipia, self-governing cities. These magistrates might organize labor crews, procure local stone from nearby quarries, or hire contractors for larger resurfacing projects. For smaller fixes, filling ruts, clearing drainage, they relied on compulsory labor, free citizens fulfilling public service obligations, or enslaved people sent out by their owners in fulfillment of a tax-like duty. In rural areas, these tasks sometimes fell to colony, tenant farmers bound to estates who had little say in the matter. Beyond the physical work, there was an astonishing amount of paperwork involved. Before a repair could begin, someone had to report the damage. A merchant, a soldier, or a postal rider might lodge a complaint with a local authority, who then had to verify the claim, assign funds or labor, and file an update with the provincial governor. This could take weeks or months. Some roads simply weren't repaired because the bureaucracy was too slow or the funds too scarce, and there was plenty of room for dispute. Inscriptions from North Africa and the Eastern Mediterranean reveal lawsuits over road maintenance, especially when landowners argued that roads near their properties were someone else's responsibility. Was it a municipal road or an imperial one? Was it originally built by a private benefactor and therefore exempt from civic maintenance? These legal gray zones often led to inaction. The Roman state also relied on a patchwork of contracts, known as locatio conductio, to keep major roads serviceable. These were essentially outsourcing agreements. A contractor or conductor would bid to repair or maintain a stretch of road, offering a price and timeline. If approved, They were held legally responsible for completing the work. Archaeological records show detailed contracts for road resurfacing, bridge reinforcement, even mile marker replacement. Some included stiff penalties for failure, others, not so much. Over time, the empire developed a more specialized road system to serve different needs. There were viae militares, military roads prioritized for upkeep, viae publicae, major public roads connecting cities and provinces, viae vicinales, local roads, often unpaved and less formally maintained, viae privatae, private roads usually, on estates maintained by landowners. Road funding sometimes reflected this hierarchy. A via militaris might receive direct funding from the imperial treasury if it linked two major forts or legionary camps. By contrast, a via vicinalis might be left to the goodwill or disinterest of local communities. But even when funding existed, the money had to come from somewhere. The Roman Empire maintained a vast treasury system, including the fiscus, imperial purse, the aerarium, senatorial treasury, and countless provincial tax offices. Road repairs often competed with other priorities: military campaigns, public games, aqueducts, temple refurbishments, or payments to border tribes. Roads that served tax collection or troop movements had better odds of getting funded. Others simply waited and crumbled. And yet, despite all this inefficiency, the roads endured. Perhaps that's what makes them so fascinating. Not that they were perfect, but that they were resilient, patchy, and human. 100 different cities, cultures, and governors contributed to their preservation, often with minimal coordination. This wasn't central planning. It was slow, uneven collaboration over centuries. Let's look at a real example: the Via Egnatia, built in the 2nd century BCE and stretching over 1,100 kilometers across the Balkans, from modern-day Albania through Macedonia to Byzantium. This road crossed mountains, rivers, and hostile territories. It was key to military operations in the east, but also to trade and governance. In the late imperial period, maintenance of the Via Egnatia became a joint effort between military engineers, local Romanized elites, and the occasional imperial edict. Some sections fell into disrepair for years. Others were resurfaced with such care that the paving stones still carry the names of the officials who commissioned them. Mile markers on this road sometimes doubled as propaganda, announcing imperial victories or dedication to the common good. One particularly revealing inscription near Thessaloniki reads, "Under the care of Marcus Calpurnius Rufus, governor of Macedonia, this stretch of road was restored in the year of the consulship of Lucius Valerius and Gaius Julius." It's a reminder that public image mattered. Politicians used road projects to signal competence. Emperors commissioned them as gifts to provinces or in memory of dynastic ancestors. Even when political chaos reigned, during civil wars or successions, emperors rushed to fix roads as if reasserting their grip on the arteries of empire. Meanwhile, small repairs continued at the ground level. The road crew you passed earlier may be just one of hundreds active at any given time, patching a pothole outside a villa in southern Gaul, or clearing a washed-out embankment in the hills of Thrace. Their tools were simple: iron crowbars, hammers, wooden carts, buckets, and chisels. Their method: remove the damaged stone, fill the cavity with new rubble or lime mortar, and lay the replacement stone flat. Then tamp it down, ensure basic drainage, and move on. It was not glamorous work. Roman authors rarely wrote about it unless in complaint. But without these crews, the system would have failed. In fact, in the late Empire, particularly after the 3rd century CE, when political instability and economic crisis weakened centralized oversight, road quality became one of the clearest signs of Rome's fading power. Reports from the time speak of flooded routes, impassable bridges, and bandits thriving along crumbling roads. The cursus publicus slowed to a crawl, and regional isolation worsened. Still, in some provinces, roads were maintained long after central authority had decayed. In Egypt, sections of Roman roads remained in use well into the Islamic period. In Britain, Anglo-Saxon rulers occasionally reused old Roman paths, repurposing milestones, and even maintaining a few key causeways. The bones of the empire endured longer than its flesh. So the question begins to form. How did a road system built and maintained so haphazardly last as long as it did? Was it the engineering, the social obligations, the sheer volume of feet, and wheels that kept paths open through friction alone? Or was it simply this, that once a road is laid down, it refuses to be forgotten? You are still on the road, somewhere on a lonely stretch near what was once the Roman frontier. The stones beneath your feet have shifted again. Some are gone, others overgrown. Lichen clings to what remains of the cambered surface, and the drainage ditches are now just shallow impressions filled with weeds. Yet the path is unmistakable. It goes on, straight and stubborn. The empire is long gone, but the road remains. E&D. The centuries following the fall of the Western Roman Empire in 476 CE, the fate of Roman roads was uneven. Some were quickly forgotten. Others were absorbed into the daily rhythms of the new post-Roman world. In certain regions, the roads were still used even if no one could remember who had built them or how. They became folklore, haunted routes, old kings' paths, roads of the giants. But let's begin with what's probably the dullest and most crucial reality. Roads are only useful if people keep using them. And in many parts of the former empire, life didn't stop just because the imperial government collapsed. Farmers still needed to move grain. Pilgrims still sought shrines. Traders still bartered in markets. So long as these movements continued, so too did the roads, even if no one officially maintained them anymore. One curious detail. Roman roads were so well built that in some cases they maintained themselves through usage. Repeated foot traffic kept the central surface clear, and animals helped prevent overgrowth along the shoulders. This maintenance by movement worked surprisingly well, until traffic patterns changed or stopped altogether due to war, depopulation, or plague. In Britain, for example, Roman roads like Watling Street and Ermine Street remained in use well into the early medieval period. Though often narrowed or partially overgrown, they were sometimes cleared and reused by local warlords and early Anglo-Saxon kings, especially when moving armies or messengers. But the farther one moved from urban centers, the worse the roads. Cottage bridges collapsed and weren't replaced. Mile markers were reused in churches or burned as stone for hearths. No central authority existed to coordinate their repair. Yet Roman roads left an enduring mental map. Early medieval monastic chroniclers in Gaul and Italy still referenced Roman roads when describing journeys or locating holy sites. Pilgrims, on the way to Rome, Santiago de Compostela or Canterbury often followed the crumbling outlines of Roman routes. These pilgrim roads, especially during the High Middle Ages, were sometimes rebuilt atop Roman foundations, continuing the legacy under the guise of new religious meaning. One such route is the Via Francigena, a path from Canterbury to Rome that overlays sections of older Roman roads through France and Italy. While no longer administered by a Roman official or marked by milestones, the Via Francigena functioned with a similar logic. Way stations, rest stops, guides, maps, and public knowledge all shaped its path. In this way, the idea of a Roman road lived on, recast in Christian terms. Meanwhile, in Byzantium, the Eastern Roman Empire that didn't fall in 476, the roads remained an integral part of governance for centuries. Roads like the Via Egnatia continued to support trade, tax collection, and imperial armies well into the 10th and 11th centuries. Byzantine engineers sometimes resurfaced old Roman roads with new paving techniques or adapted them to the shifting needs of a Christian empire. Old milestones were carved with new dates and dedications. Pagan inscriptions were chipped away or Christianized. Interestingly, Islamic empires in North Africa and the Near East also reused Roman roads. After the Muslim conquests of the 7th century, sections of Roman road in Syria, Egypt, and Tunisia became part of new transport and pilgrimage networks. The Hajj routes across the Arabian Peninsula mirrored the logistical thinking of Roman engineers. Though they weren't directly connected, the conceptual continuity is striking. Rest stations, water sources, and milestone tracking became key concerns, just as they had been under Rome. In these contexts, Roman roads weren't just useful, they were also symbols of order and civilization. Early medieval rulers sometimes used road maintenance as a way of proving legitimacy. In the Carolingian Empire under Charlemagne, royal decrees mentioned roads frequently. Though the Carolingians never matched Rome's infrastructure, their efforts to maintain travel routes, especially between monasteries and royal estates, drew on Roman precedents. But not everyone saw Roman roads as assets. In parts of northern Europe, dense forests and rivers had always made Roman-style road building difficult. As the empire retreated, new rulers in these regions sometimes viewed Roman roads as strategic liabilities. Open, straight roads made it easier for enemies to march quickly and predictably. As a result, some roads were deliberately neglected or redirected to make military ambushes harder. Fortifications, moats, and castles reshaped the landscape to prioritize defense over convenience. Even where Roman roads remained in use, their identity became increasingly ambiguous. By the 11th century, a traveler in Spain or Germany might walk on Roman stones without knowing it. Local legends often attributed the roads to biblical figures, saints, or mythical kings. In some regions, people called them devil's roads, wide and unnatural, too perfect to have been made by men. That these roads survived at all is a testament not only to Roman engineering, but to their embeddedness in human life. Roads are not immortal by themselves. They last only when societies keep needing them. Which brings us to the early modern period, where things took a strange turn. In the 16th and 17th centuries, European antiquarians began to rediscover and map out the Roman road network. They pored over medieval documents, collected milestone inscriptions, and tried to trace lost routes through overgrown hills and broken bridges. In England, for example, men like William Camden and John Horsley documented the Roman roads of Britain in obsessive detail, though often with mistaken assumptions or romanticized interpretations. These antiquarians weren't just scholars. They were part of a broader movement that sought to reconnect the modern state with its classical heritage. Mapping out Roman roads was a way of legitimizing state power, suggesting a continuity of civilization from ancient Rome to Elizabethan England, or Bourbon France or Habsburg Spain. During this period, some Roman roads were repurposed for modern traffic. In France, engineers under Napoleon rebuilt key segments of Roman routes to serve new imperial ambitions. In Italy, the Via Appia was partially restored. And in Britain, the 18th century turnpike trusts often resurfaced old Roman roads to support growing trade. But none of this would have been possible without the ghostly persistence of the roads themselves. Unlike wooden buildings or crumbled walls, Roman roads survived because they were always underfoot, literally part of the landscape. They shaped patterns of settlement, property boundaries, and even national borders. To this day, if you look at a satellite map of Europe, you can trace Roman roads hidden in modern infrastructure. Long, straight highways often follow the exact path laid down 2 millennia ago. Some modern rail lines mimic ancient causeways. In cities like Paris, London, Milan, and Cologne, the original Roman street grid still determined traffic flow. Even in places where the stones are long gone, the roads remain as cultural memory. Tourist sites, hiking trails, heritage walks, archaeological zones. Thousands of travelers retrace Roman routes each year, whether they know it or not. And so the story of Roman roads is not really about their perfection. It is about their durability amid decay, their quiet utility amid political collapse, and the way they stitched together the daily lives of soldiers, merchants, laborers, and pilgrims across centuries. Perhaps the roads were never meant to last forever. And yet they did. Not because of marble arches or imperial ambitions, but because people kept walking them, one step after another. So here's the final question. If you followed one of these roads to its very end, what would you find? Not a ruined city or a forgotten emperor, but perhaps a field, a farmhouse, and the soft echo of sandals on stone? Why most medieval soldiers never even fought, and more, you're standing in a field somewhere in northern France. It is not yet dawn, and the world is shrouded in dew and quiet tension. A faint pale fog clings low to the grass, and your breath curls in front of your face. You are wearing a padded gambeson, not yet stiff with sweat, and your legs ache from the march the day before. But you're not thinking about battle, not yet. You're wondering if someone remembered to bring breakfast. This is not the medieval battle scene you were expecting. There are no clashing swords or charging horses. Not yet, and perhaps not ever. What we call medieval warfare in textbooks or films is often reduced to the moment of violence itself. The clash of armies, the arrows flying, the chaos of melee. But for most medieval soldiers, that moment either never came, or came only after days or weeks of waiting. You waited to be paid, you waited to move, you waited to be told where to stand, and often you waited only to pack up and go home again, having never drawn your sword. In truth, the majority of medieval soldiers were not career warriors, but temporary levies, farmers, craftsmen, apprentices, called up by obligation or hired by coin. Most would never see more than one campaign in their lifetime. Even the more seasoned fighters, men-at-arms, household knights, or hired mercenaries, spent far more time organizing tents, feeding horses, mending boots, or digging latrines than they did engaging in combat. Take, for instance, the English, chevauchés of the 100 Years' War. These were long, fast-moving raids designed to burn and pillage, not fight pitched battles. The soldiers moved in columns across hostile countryside, torching crops, looting villages, and only occasionally encountering resistance. If the enemy army refused to engage, which they often did, the campaign consisted mostly of riding, burning, sleeping outdoors, and foraging. For weeks the sword might stay sheathed. It's not that medieval people feared war any less than we do today. It's that they understood its risks and costs intimately. Nobles might gain glory in battle, but only if they survived, and the ransom system meant capturing enemies was often more profitable than killing them. Commanders thus had powerful incentives to avoid large-scale slaughter when other options were available. Negotiations, feints, alliances, and bluffs were all tools of medieval strategy. A good general could win a war by simply avoiding battle, long enough for the enemy to run out of supplies. So what then did all these soldiers actually do? First and foremost, march. A medieval army was a slow, unwieldy thing, especially once it left the well-maintained roads of central towns. A force of 3,000 to 10,000 men, typical for many medieval campaigns, would be accompanied by hundreds more in support roles: cooks, armorers, surgeons, clergy, cart drivers, and muleteers. All of them had to move in something like a coordinated fashion across terrain often hostile or uncharted. Roads were often muddy or narrow. Bridges could collapse. Rivers could delay movement by days. In some cases, armies would build makeshift pontoon bridges using barrels, tree trunks, and rope. And once the weather turned, and it often did, progress slowed to a crawl. Food was a constant concern. Most armies foraged or requisitioned supplies as they moved, which is a polite way of saying they took what they needed from local peasants, with or without payment. Bread, salt pork, ale, onions, and oats were common staples. For the lower ranks, meals were often cold and eaten on the ground. The quality and availability of food could determine morale, and in extreme cases, entire armies broke down due to starvation or desertion. Then there was the issue of boredom, a less glamorous but no less real part of medieval warfare. You might spend an entire campaign standing guard, fetching water, repairing gear, or simply waiting for a message that never came. Watch duty was repetitive and taxing, especially in unfamiliar regions. A knight might spend his evening not charging into battle, but rubbing horse ointment into the flanks of a tired destrier, or patching a torn surcoat. If battle did seem imminent, anxiety would rise. Most soldiers, especially the peasant levies, had never been in a real fight, and their only training may have been a handful of local militia drills. Weapons were often mismatched or poorly made. A scythe turned into a polearm, a hammer bound, with leather, a worn wooden shield. Armor was uneven. Nobles had mail or plate, while commoners made do with thick tunics and luck. And so they waited. The field might be muddy, Rain might soak through their clothing. They might pass the time telling stories, gambling, sharpening blades that might never be drawn. Sometimes they drilled in formation. Often they simply stood. You might wonder why they didn't just leave. The truth is, many did. Desertion was common in medieval campaigns, especially among the lower ranks. If food ran out or morale broke down, entire sections of an army could vanish overnight. Others stayed because of fear, not fear of the enemy, but of their own commanders. Discipline could be brutal. Thieves might be executed. Cowards might be whipped or maimed. But more often, the glue that held armies together was custom, religion, and the promise of loot. Sometimes all the waiting was for nothing. A battle might be cancelled due to rain, as in the famously soggy summer of 1315, when Robert the Bruce's Scottish army refused to engage Edward II's soaked forces. Other times a truce might be signed at the last minute, or a lord might change his allegiance, removing the need for a fight altogether. Even when battles did occur, most soldiers were not in the front lines. A typical medieval battle was shockingly small inactive participants. The vanguard, the mounted knights, the specialized archers, they bore the brunt of combat. The rest, sometimes a majority, stood in reserve, guarded baggage, or never made it to the field due to distance or disorganization. There's a poignant moment in the chronicle of the Battle of Agincourt in 1415. A French knight, having watched hours of fruitless waiting, finally muttered, "This is no battle, it is but a butchery." For many, that was the truth. The actual fighting, when it happened, was fast, disorienting, and brutally one-sided. And for every soldier who fought, dozens more simply stood nearby, helpless or unneeded. So why did they come at all? Why raise an army if only a fraction would ever fight? The answer lies in the theater of war. Medieval military campaigns were as much about presence as they were about combat. To raise an army was to send a political message, to show strength, to assert claims, to compel negotiation. Sometimes the sheer number of soldiers you could bring to a field was enough to make your opponent withdraw. In this way, the medieval battlefield was often a stage, and the soldiers who filled it were more than fighters. They were props, threats, bargaining chips, and symbols. So here you are, standing in the mist. Your sword is clean, your shield still slung. Perhaps the enemy is just beyond the next ridge, or perhaps the banners will be lowered and the order will come to return to camp. The sun rises, burning away the fog. Somewhere a horn sounds, but you still don't know if today will be a day of battle, or just another long, quiet wait. And that raises the question, if a soldier trains, marches, waits, and never fights, is he still a warrior? These antiquarians weren't just scholars. They were part of a broader movement that sought to reconnect the modern state with its classical heritage. Mapping out Roman roads was a way of legitimizing state power, suggesting a continuity of civilization from ancient Rome to Elizabethan England, or Bourbon France or Habsburg Spain. During this period, some Roman roads were repurposed for modern traffic. In France, engineers under Napoleon rebuilt key segments of Roman routes to serve new imperial ambitions. In Italy, the Via Appia was partially restored. And in Britain, the 18th century turnpike trusts often resurfaced old Roman roads to support growing trade. But none of this would have been possible without the ghostly persistence of the roads themselves. Unlike wooden buildings or crumbled walls, Roman roads survived because they were always underfoot, literally part of the landscape. They shaped patterns of settlement, property boundaries, and even national borders. To this day, if you look at a satellite map of Europe, you can trace Roman roads hidden in modern infrastructure. Long, straight highways often follow the exact path laid down 2 millennia ago. Some modern rail lines mimic ancient causeways. In cities like Paris, London, Milan, and Cologne, the original Roman street grid still determined traffic flow. Even in places where the stones are long gone, the roads remain as cultural memory. Tourist sites, hiking trails, heritage walks, archaeological zones. Thousands of travelers retrace Roman routes each year, whether they know it or not. And so the story of Roman roads is not really about their perfection. It is about their durability amid decay, their quiet utility amid political collapse, and the way they stitched together the daily lives of soldiers, merchants, laborers, and pilgrims across centuries. Perhaps the roads were never meant to last forever. And yet they did. Not because of marble arches or imperial ambitions, but because people kept walking them, one step after another. So here's the final question. If you followed one of these roads to its very end, what would you find? Not a ruined city or a forgotten emperor, but perhaps a field, a farmhouse, and the soft echo of sandals on stone? Why most medieval soldiers never even fought, and more, you're standing in a field somewhere in northern France. It is not yet dawn, and the world is shrouded in dew and quiet tension. A faint pale fog clings low to the grass, and your breath curls in front of your face. You are wearing a padded gambeson, not yet stiff with sweat, and your legs ache from the march the day before. But you're not thinking about battle, not yet. You're wondering if someone remembered to bring breakfast. This is not the medieval battle scene you were expecting. There are no clashing swords or charging horses. Not yet, and perhaps not ever. What we call medieval warfare in textbooks or films is often reduced to the moment of violence itself. The clash of armies, the arrows flying, the chaos of melee. But for most medieval soldiers, that moment either never came, or came only after days or weeks of waiting. You waited to be paid, you waited to move, you waited to be told where to stand, and often you waited only to pack up and go home again, having never drawn your sword. In truth, the majority of medieval soldiers were not career warriors, but temporary levies, farmers, craftsmen, apprentices, called up by obligation or hired by coin. Most would never see more than one campaign in their lifetime. Even the more seasoned fighters, men-at-arms, household knights, or hired mercenaries, spent far more time organizing tents, feeding horses, mending boots, or digging latrines than they did engaging in combat. Take, for instance, the English, chevauchés of the 100 Years' War. These were long, fast-moving raids designed to burn and pillage, not fight pitched battles. The soldiers moved in columns across hostile countryside, torching crops, looting villages, and only occasionally encountering resistance. If the enemy army refused to engage, which they often did, the campaign consisted mostly of riding, burning, sleeping outdoors, and foraging. For weeks, the sword might stay sheathed. It's not that medieval people feared war any less than we do today. It's that they understood its risks and costs intimately. Nobles might gain glory in battle, but only if they survived, and the ransom system meant capturing enemies was often more profitable than killing them. Commanders thus had powerful incentives to avoid large-scale slaughter when other options were available. Negotiations, feints, alliances, and bluffs were all tools of medieval strategy. A good general could win a war by simply avoiding battle, long enough for the enemy to run out of supplies. So what then did all these soldiers actually do? First and foremost, march. A medieval army was a slow, unwieldy thing, especially once it left the well-maintained roads of central towns. A force of 3,000 to 10,000 men, typical for many medieval campaigns, would be accompanied by hundreds more in support roles: cooks, armorers, surgeons, clergy, cart drivers, and muleteers. All of them had to move in something like a coordinated fashion across terrain often hostile or uncharted. Roads were often muddy or narrow. Bridges could collapse. Rivers could delay movement by days. In some cases, armies would build makeshift pontoon bridges using barrels, tree trunks, and rope. And once the weather turned, and it often did, progress slowed to a crawl. Food was a constant concern. Most armies foraged or requisitioned supplies as they moved, which is a polite way of saying they took what they needed from local peasants, with or without payment. Bread, salt pork, ale, onions, and oats were common staples. For the lower ranks, meals were often cold and eaten on the ground. The quality and availability of food could determine morale, and in extreme cases, entire armies broke down due to starvation or desertion. Then there was the issue of boredom, a less glamorous but no less real part of medieval warfare. You might spend an entire campaign standing guard, fetching water, repairing gear, or simply waiting for a message that never came. Watch duty was repetitive and taxing, especially in unfamiliar regions. A knight might spend his evening not charging into battle, but rubbing horse ointment into the flanks of a tired destrier, or patching a torn surcoat. If battle did seem imminent, anxiety would rise. Most soldiers, especially the peasant levies, had never been in a real fight, and their only training may have been a handful of local militia drills. Weapons were often mismatched or poorly made. A scythe turned into a pole arm, a hammer bound, with leather, a worn wooden shield. Armor was uneven. Nobles had mail or plate, while commoners made do with thick tunics and luck. And so they waited. The field might be muddy. Rain might soak through their clothing. They might pass the time telling stories, gambling, sharpening blades that might never be drawn. Sometimes they drilled in formation. Often they simply stood. You might wonder why they didn't just leave. The truth is, many did. Desertion was common in medieval campaigns, especially among the lower ranks. If food ran out or morale broke down, entire sections of an army could vanish overnight. Others stayed because of fear, not fear of the enemy, but of their own commanders. Discipline could be brutal. Thieves might be executed. Cowards might be whipped or maimed. But more often, the glue that held armies together was custom, religion, and the promise of loot. Sometimes all the waiting was for nothing. A battle might be cancelled due to rain, as in the famously soggy summer of 1315, when Robert the Bruce's Scottish army refused to engage Edward II's soaked forces. Other times a truce might be signed at the last minute, or a lord might change his allegiance, removing the need for a fight altogether. Even when battles did occur, most soldiers were not in the front lines. A typical medieval battle was shockingly small in active participants. The vanguard, the mounted knights, the specialized archers, they bore the brunt of combat. The rest, sometimes a majority, stood in reserve, guarded baggage, or never made it to the field due to distance or disorganization. There's a poignant moment in the chronicle of the Battle of Agincourt in 1415. A French knight, having watched hours of fruitless waiting, finally muttered, "This is no battle, it is but a butchery." For many, that was the truth. The actual fighting, when it happened, was fast, disorienting, and brutally one-sided. And for every soldier who fought, dozens more simply stood nearby, helpless or unneeded. So why did they come at all? Why raise an army if only a fraction would ever fight? The answer lies in the theater of war. Medieval military campaigns were as much about presence as they were about combat. To raise an army was to send a political message, to show strength, to assert claims, to compel negotiation. Sometimes the sheer number of soldiers you could bring to a field was enough to make your opponent withdraw. In this way, the medieval battlefield was often a stage, and the soldiers who filled it were more than fighters. They were props, threats, bargaining chips, and symbols. So here you are, standing in the mist. Your sword is clean, your shield still slung. Perhaps the enemy is just beyond the next ridge, or perhaps the banners will be lowered and the order will come to return to camp. The sun rises, burning away the fog. Somewhere a horn sounds, but you still don't know if today will be a day of battle, or just another long, quiet wait. And that raises the question, if a soldier trains, marches, waits, and never fights, is he still a warrior? You're still in the field, but now the sun is higher in the sky. Morning fog has lifted, replaced by the acrid scent of campfires and boiled onions. The sounds have changed too, less murmured waiting, more movement. Somewhere nearby, a horse kicks against its hitching post. A young squire yells about a missing girth strap. The low hum of nervous preparation ripples across the camp, but no one is fighting. Not yet. Probably not today. In the medieval world, war was a slow ritual more than a fast explosion. For all the waiting soldiers did, commanders waited too, watching the enemy lines, counting wagons, praying for reinforcements. A typical battle wasn't something you rushed into. It was negotiated, postured, tested. Spies were sent, alliances, Double-checked. Sometimes both sides stared across an open field for 3 days, neither willing to be the first to move. It wasn't cowardice. It was pragmatism. War was expensive and bodies were hard to replace. For every dramatic account of a famous clash like Hastings or Agincourt, there are dozens of almost battles where troops gathered only to disperse again. In 1173, during the revolt of the young king, King Henry II's forces camped across from rebel armies for nearly a week, only for a last-minute negotiation to dissolve the standoff. Most of the soldiers were sent home. Few would remember the campaign, but those who had marched hundreds of miles to get there, farmers conscripted from distant shires, still carried the aches in their bones, the blisters on their feet, and the memory of having waited for something that never happened. The psychology of that waiting is important. You were not just idle. You were watching and fearing. Rumors rippled through the camp like wildfire. The enemy is just beyond the hill. They have more cavalry than we do. Their archers carry poison. You couldn't verify anything, but your stomach twisted just the same. These weren't trained soldiers as we imagine today. They were often poorly equipped, often poorly led, and deeply superstitious. Many believed in omens. A bird flying overhead the wrong way, a black dog seen at dusk, a priest failing to hold his candle straight during morning prayers. All of it fed into a slow, boiling anxiety that could consume an army from the inside. This is where the role of ceremony and ritual became essential. The medieval military experience was rich with pageantry, banners unfurled, mass held before dawn, relics brought out from monasteries to inspire troops. In one 14th century campaign, a fragment of the True Cross was paraded through camp by barefoot monks to harden the hearts of the hesitant. These rituals weren't just for faith, they were psychological armor against uncertainty. Even the most skeptical soldier could draw comfort from the rhythm of liturgy, the scent of incense, the steady murmur of psalms in Latin. When there was combat, it was often brief, brutally so. A medieval battle once begun might last less than 2 hours and sometimes less than 1. Most were over in a single charge. Lines broke quickly and panic spread faster than swords. If your side fled, your job wasn't to fight, it was to run. And if you ran, you hoped the enemy didn't pursue because pursuit was where the real slaughter happened. Most casualties didn't occur in the clash itself. They came in the retreat, when backs were turned, when shields were lowered, and even that kind of combat was the exception. You, the average soldier, were far more likely to experience siege warfare than open battle. Sieges were drawn-out affairs of endurance and boredom. You might be stationed outside a stone fortress for weeks or months waiting for the defenders to starve or surrender. Your daily tasks included digging trenches, moving stones, stacking firewood, fetching water, and swatting away flies. Occasionally, you might operate a trebuchet or carry a scaling ladder, but more often you did little more than stand guard, hoping no one dropped boiling oil on your head. Inside the walls, things weren't better. The defenders, too, spent most of their time waiting, watching, boiling what little food they had, sending out pigeons with messages, occasionally launching a sortie to destroy the enemy's siege engines. But these moments of action were rare. For both attacker and defender, the siege was a test of patience and planning, not courage alone. Even the most storied knights understood that their prowess with a sword would mean nothing if the grain wagons didn't arrive on time. War was logistics, salted pork, milled flour, shoeing the horses, mending the tents, cleaning out the latrines. These were the acts that defined a medieval campaign. Men died from exposure and dysentery far more often than they did from blade or arrow. You might think the nobility were above all this. Not quite. A lord on campaign had servants, yes, but he also had duties. Overseeing supply routes, hosting councils of war, answering messages from the king. Some took to it with relish. Others grew tired of the wait. One chronicler recorded a noble who, after a week of indecision in front of a castle in Brittany, simply rode off mid-siege to go hawking, bored and irritated by the stalemate. The soldiers stayed behind, digging trenches. The noble returned, 3 days later, reportedly with a goose and a smile. Even when a fight finally did come and swords were drawn, most soldiers still found themselves on the periphery. The clamor of metal, the screams, the smell of sweat and blood. It was real, but it was localized. 100 men might fight while 5,000 stood. And when it ended, if it ended, your role returned immediately to the mundane. Tending the bao, wounded, collecting the fallen, repairing weapons, or simply collapsing in the grass, too exhausted to care. There are detailed accounts from surviving levies after battles. One, from a common archer after the Battle of Shrewsbury in 1403, spoke not of glory but of how hard it was to pull arrows from the dead, to reuse them. Another wrote in the margins of a psalter about how his feet bled more from the standing than from the march. In these quiet testimonies we glimpse a truth, that the experience of war was not the moment of violence, but the long, grinding sequence of days and nights in its shadow. And yet, for all of this, the idea of the medieval soldier has been romanticized. We remember the charging knight, the archer with the longbow, the squire who saves the day. We do not remember the man who spent 6 weeks building a palisade in the rain, only to watch the enemy surrender without a fight. We do not remember the man who never saw the enemy's face but died anyway from a cut on his foot that festered in camp. That is what makes the story worth telling, because the history of medieval warfare is not just the history of who won and who lost. It is the history of how people endured, how they ate, how they waited, how they feared, how they carried on. It's not glamorous, but it's real. The texture of lived experience. And it's the kind of history we sleep on, literally and metaphorically. So as you sit now by your imaginary campfire, woolen cloak around your shoulders, cup of weak ale in hand, you might wonder, if the fight never came and you spent your entire campaign marching, cooking, digging, and waiting, did you truly go to war? The war is over, at least for now. There's no grand announcement, no trumpets echoing across the hills, no banners lowered in final triumph. Instead, you find yourself back on the muddy road that brought you here. Your feet still ache, the leather of your boots stiff with old sweat and dried mud. You've lost weight, you've gained blisters. Your sword was never drawn, and yet you feel older somehow, not just in your limbs but behind your eyes. Because even without battle, you were part of war. You endured the weight of it. This quiet aftermath is the most forgotten part of medieval conflict. The return home. It was rarely as triumphant as we imagine. Most medieval soldiers didn't come home with spoils or tales of valor. They came, back empty-handed, sometimes injured, often changed. The experience wasn't glorious. It was disruptive. For a tenant farmer conscripted by a local lord, returning home could mean finding the fields overgrown, taxes unpaid, family scattered. War took time, and in the Middle Ages, time was life. A missed harvest could mean famine, and sometimes there was no home to return to. Some campaigns dragged on for so long that soldiers never made it back. Others, after being dismissed, became wanderers too injured or disillusioned to reintegrate. England in the 14th century was littered with such men, discharged archers who had seen France but not battle, veterans of sieges that never escalated, men whose lives now existed in tavern, corners muttering about the campaign of 61 that never turned to blood but lasted just the same. This period after the campaign reveals something else about medieval warfare: the lack of documentation for the ordinary. Chroniclers, when they existed, wrote about kings and charges and treaties. They did not usually write about the man who was tasked with burying the horses. They didn't mention the peasant who twisted his ankle carrying water to the trenches and spent 2 weeks wrapped in cloth, hoping the swelling would go down. But these were the common experiences. These were the norms. Occasionally, we glimpse their stories in strange places. Legal records mostly. A dispute over land where a tenant claimed he had been conscripted and was therefore unable to pay his dues. A will where a soldier asked that his damaged boots be buried with him. A scribbled margin note in a religious text about the smell of The latrines at the Siege of Caen. These fragments paint a quiet mosaic of reality, not heroism, and they remind us that survival, not combat, defined the soldier's life. Sometimes campaigns ended with negotiations rather than violence. Land changed hands, nobles married off daughters, and armies were told to go home. What did that feel like for a soldier who had marched hundreds of miles, eaten hard cheese until his teeth ached, stood in rain for hours on end while staring at a stone wall? Relief? Frustration? Or perhaps confusion? He had prepared to fight. He had been afraid. And now it was over. Just like that. But not every post-campaign experience was so anticlimactic. For some, war lingered, in the body and in the mind. While medieval people had no concept of post-traumatic stress disorder as we do today, the effects were there. Accounts describe men who fell to trembling at loud noises, or who spoke no more of France after returning. Others took to religious orders, seeking solace in faith. A few joined mercenary bands, because the campaign, even without battle, had become their only identity. It was easier to keep marching than to settle back into the silence of village life. There's something else to consider here, and it might be the quietest truth of all. Many medieval soldiers didn't want to fight. They weren't cowards, but they weren't trained killers either. They were compelled by obligation, by economy, by desperation. War was a job, a burden, something you did because you had to. When the army disbanded and you returned home, the hope wasn't that people would admire you. The hope was that life could go back to normal, that the animals were still alive, that the thatch hadn't leaked, that your tools hadn't rusted. And yet, war changed things, even quiet wars. When a local campaign drew men away, the entire village structure was shaken. Labor patterns shifted. Women and children took over fields. Elders filled roles they hadn't touched in decades. When the men returned, they often found things done differently, and not always worse. Some found their old status eroded, especially if they came back injured or with no coin. Some never regained their old positions. The military campaigns also spread more than just men. They spread ideas, diseases, and objects. A soldier from northern England might come home with a French belt buckle or new words in his speech picked up from Flemish cooks. Some brought lice infestations. Others brought stories that mixed fact and fiction. Accounts of cities with stone towers taller than cathedrals, rivers so wide you couldn't see the other side, women with golden hair who sang at dusk. These tales, shaped by long nights of marching and longer nights in smoky camps, eventually became folklore, and sometimes the stories became legends. A soldier who had never lifted a sword might, years later, claim he stood beside a great knight in battle. Memory is malleable. The dullness of real experience bends under the pressure of retelling. In a village tavern, silence isn't rewarded, so stories grow sharper edges. The muddy fields become blood-soaked meadows. The fearful waiting becomes noble patience. The avoidance of battle becomes tactical cunning. But the real soldier, the one you would have been, knows better. You remember the cold, the boredom, the rats. You remember counting the days and watching the sky and wondering if the enemy across the field was any different from you. You didn't fight. Not really. But you endured. And that's what made you a soldier in the Middle Ages. Not the swing of a sword, but the weeks of hunger and silence that came before it. So much of history is written by and for those who fought. The kings, the victors, the chroniclers paid to remember names. But in this quiet corner of the past we find something else. A legion of men who never fought but still served, who marched without glory, waited without reward, and returned home with nothing but worn-out shoes and the memory of tension that never resolved. So now, as the imaginary sun sets over the fictive hills of your campaign, you wonder, if history forgets the soldiers who never fought, what else? What other lives, days, details has it quietly erased? Why Roman roads were an absolute nightmare to maintain, and more, you probably imagine a Roman road as something straight, indestructible, and eternal. After all, the phrase "all roads lead to Rome" wasn't just a poetic metaphor. The Romans constructed more than 250,000 miles of roads at their peak, an engineering feat that connected cities, ports, frontier outposts, and everything in between. These roads were a key pillar of imperial power. Soldiers marched on them, taxes traveled on them, and ideas flowed with the caravans that rumbled steadily over the stones. But what you don't often hear is what happened after they were built. Because building a Roman road may have been a triumph of planning and engineering, but maintaining one was an unending, thankless nightmare. Let's begin quite literally from the ground up. A typical Roman road was not a simple strip of packed dirt. It was an elaborate, layered structure designed to last. A trench was dug, filled with crushed stone, statumen, followed by a layer of cemented gravel, rudus, then finer gravel mixed with lime, nucleus, and finally, on important roads, a paved surface of fitted stones, summum dorsum. This structure made for durability, but only if maintained. Otherwise, water seeped in, frost heaved the stonework, and weeds tore through the weakest seams. In the dry summer sun, dust coated everything. In the wet months, that same dust became mud that clogged drains and overflowed into nearby fields. And so came the road inspectors, known in Latin as curatores viarum. They were officials appointed to oversee the upkeep of major roads, but they rarely did the work themselves. Instead, they coordinated laborers, often slaves, soldiers, or local peasants conscripted for public works duty, who patched holes, replaced paving stones, and re-cleared drainage ditches. These workers toiled in the sun with little fanfare. Their names, unlike those of military commanders or city architects, are lost to history. The system wasn't always efficient. Roman road maintenance was funded by a combination of state money, private donations, and tolls. Yes, ancient tolls existed. Wealthy citizens might sponsor the repair of a local stretch of road and inscribe their name on a milestone to advertise their generosity. But if the coffers ran dry or political will faltered, the roads were simply left to rot. Especially in the provinces, far from the gaze of Rome, potholes grew into trenches and causeways crumbled into the earth. To really understand the scale of the problem, imagine you are a road worker in 3rd century Gaul. The empire is beginning to strain under external pressure. You have been sent with a team to inspect a portion of the Via Agrippa, which connects Lyon to the northern reaches of the Rhine. It's spring. The frost has just thawed, revealing cracks and bulges beneath the tightly fitted paving slabs. A cart has overturned, its axle snapped in a hidden rut. Your job is to find flat stones of the proper size, lift the broken ones out, no small task considering they weigh hundreds of pounds, and replace them before more damage is done. You don't have mechanized tools. You have picks, levers, and your back. You rely on donkeys to haul stones, some of which have to be sourced from quarries miles away. If you're lucky, the local magistrate has authorized funds to pay the workers with bread and wine. If not, you might rely on volunteers, a polite term for forced laborers. Maintenance wasn't just physical, it was bureaucratic. Curatores viarum had to keep written records. What sections had been inspected, what repairs were needed, how much funding had been spent. This meant parchment, ink, and administrative staff, many of whom were stationed in small roadside offices or government stations, the forgotten ancestors of modern highway departments. The work was slow, subject to delays, and constantly falling behind. Now picture the bigger problem, Rome itself. The urban streets of the capital were choked with traffic, carts, animals, people, waste. The basalt paving stones worn by centuries of use had to be replaced regularly. Because of the noise and congestion, most vehicle traffic was banned during daylight hours. Repairs often had to be carried out at night. Workers navigated narrow alleys lit by oil lamps, shoveling refuse, and hammering loose stones back into place while trying not to wake sleeping citizens. Inscriptions from the late Empire suggest entire stretches of roadwork would be halted for months, simply because someone forgot to deliver a shipment of lime. Outside the cities, weather was an unrelenting enemy. In colder regions, freezing and thawing cycles played havoc with the roadbeds. In the marshlands of Britannia, Foundations had to be reinforced constantly to prevent sinking. In North Africa, sandstorms buried sections of road, requiring crews to dig them out again and again. This wasn't the work of conquest. It was the endless, exhausting process of upkeep. Complicating matters further was the creeping privatization of road maintenance. As imperial control weakened in the later centuries, more and more roads fell into local hands. Landowners were responsible for road segments that passed through their estates. Some took pride in the task, restoring ancient milestones and organizing crews to clear brush. Others saw it as a burden or ignored it entirely. Travelers might pass from a well-maintained stretch of roadway into a weed-choked mess within a few hundred feet, depending on who owned the land. And yet, for all its flaws, the system endured. People kept traveling. Roads connected markets, courts, festivals, and military garrisons. They enabled trade, communication, and, eventually, the spread of Christianity. Letters written in Spain could reach the eastern provinces in weeks. Caravans brought olive oil from the Aegean to the British Isles. All of it depended on roads, and those roads, in turn, depended on the quiet, continuous labor of men whose names we will never know. The strange irony is that many of these roads outlasted the empire itself. Long after the western provinces fell, Roman roads continued to function, repurposed by local kingdoms, pilgrims, and traders. Medieval monks used them on their way to shrines. Napoleon marched troops down them. Even today, in parts of Europe, modern highways follow the path laid down by Roman engineers, sometimes built literally atop the ancient stones. But this endurance masks the truth. The roads only survived because they were maintained, not in glory or celebration, but in dull daily work. When a section failed, people noticed. Trade slowed, messages were delayed, crops couldn't reach towns, so someone, somewhere had to haul the stones, clear the muck, and reset the drain. And now, as you picture one of these ancient roads, perhaps stretching in a dead straight line to the horizon, sun baking the dust, a lone worker hammering at a broken stone, you might wonder, if a civilization is remembered for its roads, should we not also remember the ones who bent over to fix them? If the Roman road system was the body of the empire, then its bureaucracy was the circulatory system, pumping money, orders, and people into every extremity. We often think of roads as static things, unmoving, unchanging ribbons of stone. But in the Roman world, they were living infrastructure, and the web of administration that kept them functioning was almost as complex as the roads themselves. Maintenance wasn't just about replacing stones, it was about organizing legions of workers, collecting taxes in kind, monitoring wear, and managing entire logistical networks spread across the ancient world. The physical labor was backbreaking, but behind every shovel and chisel stood a clerk with a wax tablet, a governor issuing decrees, and a scribe tracking it all on scrolls miles from the dust. Let's step into the mind of a mid-level Roman administrator, perhaps a procurator or a curator viarum, tasked with managing a major road segment in the province of Africa Proconsularis, which today stretches across parts of modern Tunisia and Libya. The region was known for its fertile lands and produced enormous quantities of grain. That grain needed to move, from inland farms to coastal ports, and from there to Rome. The road infrastructure was crucial to the empire's stomach. Every year, the road's condition was evaluated, often following the spring rains when damage was most apparent. Inspectors noted where drainage ditches had overflowed, where carts had collapsed under their own weight, and which bridges had suffered structural wear. And then came the reports. These were compiled in triplicate, yes, even then on papyrus or wax, reviewed by the local governor's staff, and often sent to Rome for approval if the needed repairs exceeded a certain cost. These administrators didn't just file reports. They conducted interviews with landowners, coordinated with military engineers, and sometimes had to beg wealthier citizens to sponsor road repairs out of their own pocket. The expectation was that prominent citizens would contribute financially to the upkeep of public infrastructure, part civic pride, part political maneuvering. A stretch of road with a beautifully cut new stone surface might carry an inscription, like, "This section restored by Marcus Gaius Flavius, patron of the colony of Thysdrus." It's easy to romanticize that system, wealthy nobles funding civic projects, but in truth it was inconsistent and often political. Some nobles overpromised and underdelivered. Others focused their contributions only on high-traffic areas that would win them public admiration, while the backcountry trails fell into disrepair. A road used by shepherds and donkey carts in the hills was as vital to local life as the grand highways of the legions, but it rarely got the same attention. The Roman tax system was also entwined with road maintenance. In some areas, local taxes weren't paid in coin but in kind, grain, livestock, or even labor. A smallholder farmer might be expected to send a son or nephew to work on the roads for a few weeks each year. If he didn't comply, he could face fines or lose favor with local officials. It was, in a way, a form of ancient conscription, not for war, but for infrastructure. Road labor, while crucial, was low status. It was rarely done by Roman citizens unless they were desperate. Instead, the task often fell to enslaved laborers, prisoners of war, or peasants in obligation. They were divided into teams, each supervised by a foreman who answered to a government-appointed overseer. Some crews specialized in bridge work, others in paving stones, and still others in ditch clearance or tree felling. It was not glamorous work, and few records of the laborers survive, but without them, the roads would have disappeared into weeds and water. The roads also needed constant surveillance. Along the major routes, Roman officials constructed way stations known as mutationes for changing horses, and mansiones for lodging. These stations weren't just rest stops for travelers, they were logistical hubs. Staffed by imperial slaves or low-ranking civil servants, they maintained equipment, tracked military movements, and often recorded damage to nearby road sections. If a station reported that a culvert had collapsed or a segment of paving was slipping downhill, a repair order might be dispatched within days, though fulfillment could take weeks or even months. The movement of imperial couriers, known as the cursus publicus, depended on these stations. The cursus publicus was the official Roman postal system, and it relied entirely on the efficiency of the roads and the speed of the horses. These couriers wore official badges and could requisition fresh horses from any mutatio along their route. But if the road ahead was washed out, their progress stopped, and so these couriers became de facto inspectors, filing urgent damage reports and demanding repairs. Yet bureaucracy moved slowly. A road might be scheduled for repair in April, but not receive materials until late July. Delays in quarry shipments, bandit attacks on transport carts, or disputes over labor quotas could derail the entire plan. Roads were not maintained in a vacuum. They were subject to the same human weaknesses as the rest of Roman administration: corruption, delays, miscommunication, and then there was weather. A sudden flood could undo weeks of work. River crossings were particularly vulnerable. Roman bridges, although marvels of engineering, required constant vigilance. Wooden elements rotted, stone blocks loosened over time, and excessive weight, especially from overloaded wagons, could cause slow creeping collapses. When a bridge failed, rerouting traffic added miles to already long journeys, and merchants complained bitterly. In mountainous regions, landslides buried road segments entirely. Crews then had to clear debris by hand or redirect the road entirely around the slide zone. In the Alps, snow blocked passes for months at a time. Spring maintenance wasn't just about cleaning up. It was about rediscovering the road itself beneath the ice and stone. At the empire's edge, things became more complex. Take the Roman provinces in the Levant, modern Syria, Lebanon, and Israel. Here, roads connected forts, trade outposts, and caravan routes stretching deep into desert lands. The arid climate caused dust to build up on stone surfaces, polishing them to a treacherous slickness. Wind-driven sand eroded mortar and scoured away road markings. The empire maintained a small army of desert laborers just to sweep and recompact the gravel shoulders, keeping the desert at bay one shovel at a time. Maintenance here wasn't just a logistical issue, it was strategic. The road from Damascus to Palmyra was crucial for trade with the Parthian East. If that route failed, Merchants would detour through rival territories, costing Rome taxes and influence. In this way, a single neglected road section could shift regional power. Even in Noaim decline, the Roman administration tried to hold things together. The Codex Theodosianus, a legal code from the 5th century CE, includes dozens of edicts about road upkeep, orders forbidding heavy carts from traveling during the rainy season, mandates for bridge inspections, and penalties for officials who failed to enforce road tolls properly. It was a last-ditch effort to hold on to the empire's arteries, even as the body faltered. And then there was religion. As Christianity spread through the empire, pilgrims began to travel more frequently to holy sites. Roads that once carried soldiers now carried monks and hermits. The paths to Rome, Jerusalem, and other centers of faith took on a new kind of significance. Church leaders lobbied to maintain pilgrimage routes, sometimes diverting imperial funds toward sacred paths. Monasteries often adopted road maintenance as part of their service to the faithful, sweeping stones, offering shelter, and restoring mile markers. The road, once a tool of empire, became a path of spiritual connection. Still, for every repaired section, another crumbled. In the end, the problem of Roman roads wasn't about stone or sand. It was about scale. The empire was too vast, its needs too complex. The bureaucratic machinery that once coordinated armies and aqueducts began to grind slowly, then sporadically, then not at all. As Roman central authority eroded, local communities took charge of what they could. Some roads disappeared entirely, swallowed by forest or field. Others remained in partial use, with rutted wheel paths meandering through the old paving stones like veins in old marble. Farmers plowed around ancient curbs. Children played among crumbling milestones. The grand road system became a skeleton, still, present, but barely alive. And so we're left with a question. If a civilization's greatness lies not in what it builds, but in what it sustains, what does it mean when the stones begin to sink? You find yourself walking along a Roman road, though the year is no longer 200 CE, it is 768. The Western Roman Empire has long since collapsed, and the Eastern Byzantine remnant has retreated far from Gaul, Hispania, and Britannia. The stones beneath your feet are uneven, sprouting grass in the seams. The road once connected major cities. Now it leads from a crumbling monastery to a village that doesn't even appear on any maps. Time has washed over this road like water, over rock, but somehow it's still here. In the centuries after Rome's fall, its roads persisted, some through use, others through neglect. The great arteries of empire did not vanish all at once. They decayed gradually, morphing into something more organic, less managed, more local. Roads were repurposed, often without ceremony, by people who may have only dimly understood who had built them in the first place. In Britain, farmers tore up paving stones to build walls and sheep pens. In Gaul, bishops assumed responsibility for parts of the road network to encourage pilgrimages. In Spain, Roman roads slowly became the paths of early Christian processions and the supply lines of Visigothic kings. We sometimes imagine historical transitions as sharp breaks, a fall, a conquest, a revolution, but more often, change creeps in like fog. And for the Roman roads, change was slow. In many places, the basic structure of a road remained usable for hundreds of years. The layers of stone, the engineered curves for water runoff, and the foundation of crushed gravel were all overbuilt to such a degree that even centuries of neglect couldn't fully erase them. Still, without centralized maintenance, the roads slowly lost their coherence. Bridges collapsed and were not rebuilt. Drainage ditches filled with mud and weeds. The carefully laid paving stones shifted with frost and tree roots. The mile markers that once told precise distances between towns were toppled or stolen. Many travelers had no idea they were even walking a Roman road, only that it was better than trying to cross open land. And yet, these forgotten paths continued to shape Europe. Charlemagne, who was crowned emperor in 800 CE, understood the power of infrastructure. He used remnants of Roman roads to move his armies, connect monasteries, and centralize administration in his vast realm. His empire, though short-lived, marked one of the first major attempts in post-Roman Europe to revive old logistical systems. Charlemagne ordered road maintenance as part of royal decrees, often in partnership with the church. The clergy, increasingly powerful, took on responsibilities the Roman state had abandoned, and with them came new layers of organization, monks replacing magistrates, abbots replacing governors. Still, much of what was repaired depended not on imperial will but on practicality. Roads that linked economically vital regions, grain-producing valleys, coastal ports, rich monastic centers, were more likely to survive. Elsewhere, entire routes faded into forest, remembered only in the names of towns like Via, Strada, or Calle Real, lingering linguistic fossils that whispered of their Roman origin. By the 11th and 12th centuries, as trade across Europe expanded and pilgrimages grew more popular, interest in road building was reborn. Towns sprang up along old Roman routes, and travelers often walked the same stones as soldiers once had. Roman roads formed the backbone of what would become Europe's medieval trade networks: the Via Francigena, the Camino de Santiago, and the Old Appian Way, all pulsed with new life, layered with centuries of use. But here's the thing. They were no longer Roman roads. They were medieval roads, built atop Roman bones. The engineering had changed, the maintenance was communal, and the purpose had shifted from conquest and tax collection to commerce and devotion. What had once been arteries of empire became threads in a growing patchwork of local domains. Even today, some modern highways follow the path of Roman roads. The A1 Autostrada in Italy overlays the ancient Via Flaminia. The British A5 traces the route of Watling Street. And in parts of France, narrow country lanes run arrow-straight through forests where Roman surveyors once walked with gromas and chalk. So what remains of the Roman road system? Not the stones, not most of them. Not the workers. They are long, dead and unnamed. Not even the laws that governed their construction. What survives is the pattern, the shape of movement, the idea that connectivity can shape civilization. Roman roads were not just practical, they were intentional. Every mile was a claim. That order could stretch across continents, that distant provinces could be bound together by rock and discipline. And yet the same system that had once united an empire became impossible to maintain. The scale was too great, the needs too complex. Over time, the greatness of Roman engineering met the limits of Roman governance. Infrastructure, once the symbol of empire, became its silent ruin. Think of this. Every great civilization leaves behind more than its monuments. It leaves behind its forgotten duties, its ditches that no longer get cleared, its stones that no longer get reset. A road left to rot tells a quieter story than a toppled palace, but it is no less revealing. We often think of ruins as tragic, but Roman roads offer something subtler. They're not so much destroyed as repurposed, reimagined, relayered. Unlike temples or aqueducts, which crumble in place, roads get walked, overgrown, rewalked. They vanish and reappear. They live in layers. So when you drive down a straight, road cutting through a European countryside, you might just be tracing a 2,000-year-old decision to connect one place to another. And somewhere beneath the asphalt or buried under moss and gravel, the old Roman stones may still be there, holding up the weight of time. And perhaps the real legacy of Roman roads isn't that they connected the empire, but that they kept being used long after the empire was gone. What does it mean, after all, when the infrastructure outlives the civilization that built it? What did medieval people actually do all day and more? The sky is still dark when you wake, and it is cold. You are not a knight, or a lady, or even a monk. You are a peasant, one of millions, living in 13th century England, or perhaps France, or the German-speaking regions of the Holy Roman Empire. You do not think of the century you live in. Your world is not framed by dates or kings. It is framed by seasons, church bells, and chores. Your bed, if you can call it that, is a straw-stuffed sack, possibly shared with a spouse, children, or even a goat if the weather is bad. The floor beneath you is hard-packed earth. Smoke from Last night's fire still clings to the rafters and your breath makes clouds in the chill. It is sometime between 4 and 5 in the morning. No clock tells you this, but the roosters are stirring, and your body is already trained to rise before the sun. Before you do anything else, you pray. Quietly, out loud or silently, you murmur a few words to the Virgin Mary or your patron saint, not because you are especially devout, though you probably are, but because it's simply what people do. Your entire world is soaked in religion. Every day of your life is part of a liturgical rhythm. Saints' feast days, holy fasts, the occasional miracle. These things are not supernatural intrusions, but part of the natural order. You pull on a woolen tunic that hasn't been washed in weeks. Maybe it was your father's before you. Maybe it smells faintly of lanolin and smoke. You wrap your legs in strips of cloth, tie them with cords, and step into stiff leather shoes. There is no mirror. You do not need one. You will see yourself reflected in the still water of a trough, perhaps, or in your neighbor's eyes. Your first task is to rekindle the fire if it's gone out, or stoke it if it isn't. Fire means warmth, but more importantly, it means food. You grind a bit of barley or oats, your hands are calloused from it, and make a thin gruel. No sugar, no cinnamon, just water and grain. If you're lucky, there's yesterday's bread. Hard as stone, but filling. If your village is near a forest or stream, there may be herbs or mushrooms dried from summer. The gruel simmers while the village begins to stir. There is no loud noise, no mechanical alarm, only the occasional cough, the creak of thatched roofs, the muffled bleating of animals. Your home, like most, is a cruck house, wooden beams bent into an arch, daubed with wattle and plaster, topped with a roof of layered straw. It is not built to last forever, but it does well enough against the rain. You eat quickly. There is no table. The spoon is wooden. The bowl might be clay or carved from a knot of wood passed down through generations. Children, if you have them, are half asleep. The older ones will help today. The younger ones will stay close too. The home under your spouse's care or another family's if you both work the fields. Your day's labor depends on the season. In spring and summer you'll be outdoors, plowing, planting, hoeing. In autumn it's harvesting. In winter it's mending fences, preparing fuel, making tools, or helping repair the church roof if it needs it. On this particular day, let's say it's late spring. The fields are green and muddy. You grab your hoe and your sickle, their handles worn smooth from use. You step outside and feel the dew soak into your shoes. Outside, the village is slowly waking. You nod at neighbors, but don't talk much. Everyone has work to do. There are maybe 150 people here, maybe more. The village is a cluster of homes, a church, a well, and a few sheds. There is a lord who owns this land, but he does not live here. He has a manor some miles away. You have never seen his chambers, but you've heard rumors of tapestries and rooms with tiled floors. You are a serf, technically bound to the land. You cannot legally leave without permission. But in practice, you know people who've wandered off, or joined nearby towns, or been absorbed into religious orders. The lines are not always so rigid as the law books claim. Your work today begins in a long, narrow strip of land called a celion. It's part of the open field system where village lands are divided into thin strips so that no one person has all the fertile spots or all the poor ones. You don't own this land. You use it. Some of your time is also owed to the domain, the Lord's land, where you are required to work a few days a week without pay. Today is not a domain day. Today you work for yourself. You hoe weeds. Your body bent low, your back aches, you shift often. You try to work rhythmically, hoe step, hoe step. Every few minutes you glance up, not out of wonder but to check the clouds. Rain could ruin a week's worth of labor. There is no weather forecast. You've learned to read the wind and the movement of the birds. By mid-morning, you pause. Your hands are blistered, though they usually are. You drink from a leather flask filled with weak ale. Water is risky. Ale, boiled during brewing, is safer. There is no breakfast. Not in the modern sense, but perhaps you chew on a bit of bread or a raw onion from your satchel. You continue working until midday. A church bell rings, distant but clear. It's the only clock that matters. Everyone stops. You walk back to the village for the main meal. Dinner eaten while the sun is high. The meal is simple, perhaps pottage, a thick stew of barley, peas, and whatever vegetables are available. Meat is rare. If someone in the village caught a rabbit, it might be shared, but often not. You eat quickly, seated on a low bench or the ground. There is no privacy, no ceremony. The food is filling, and you are grateful. After dinner, you return to the fields. The sun is hot now. You tie a rag over your head to block the light. Children run through the tall grass. Some help, others play. You are dimly aware of the rhythms of their laughter, like birdsong. You do not pause to reflect on it. There is no work-life balance. There is just life, and work is part of it. As the afternoon wanes, you repair a section of fence, check for mole tunnels, and speak briefly with a neighbor about the next planting rotation. You've heard there might be a new rotation system coming from the next village over, 3-field instead of 2-field. It sounds revolutionary, but you're not sure. You've always done things this way. Evening begins as the sky shifts color and the fields darken. The temperature drops. You walk home in silence, passing a few returning neighbors. The village well is busy. A woman hauls water in a wooden bucket. Someone is already lighting the evening fire. Once home, you help patch the roof with straw. You rewrap your sore foot. You eat a crust of bread with a smear of salt or lard. There is no dessert. There is no tea. There are no leftovers. You sit near the fire, not for entertainment, but for heat. Someone hums. A child fidgets with a carved stick. Someone mutters about the priest's sermon last week. A small argument breaks out over who moved the tools. It fizzles quickly. There is no light but firelight. No books, no writing, no idle chatter. Just the long, slow fade into sleep. You lie down in your clothes, wrap a rough wool blanket around your shoulders, and close your eyes to the sound of wind and low voices. This is an ordinary day. No battles, no politics, no plague. Just a day. Tomorrow will be nearly identical. And, yet in the great span of human history, how many millions of such days stacked upon each other to build the world we know? What, then, did people dream about in a world where every day looked the same? The rhythm of medieval life did not change much from day to day, but it shifted with the seasons. Spring's wet soil gave way to the dry, cracking earth of summer. And by midsummer, the days were long, hot, and filled with the kind of work that didn't wait. In the 13th century, no day off was a guarantee, but Sundays and feast days broke the monotony. Still, even feast days could be full of work, just different kinds of it. Washing, fixing, preparing, mending, mulling over the same concerns as always. By midsummer, the village has already lived through planting season and now prepares for the first of the harvests. Haymaking is the first great communal effort of summer. This isn't just gathering grass, it's a vital part of survival. You cut it, dry it, and stack it so your animals won't starve in winter. If you have animals, that is. Some families do, some don't. But even if you don't, you work because you might barter for hay or be paid in food or goodwill. Sometimes the only currency that matters. Haymaking is hot, slow work. Men, women, and children all take part, cutting with scythes in wide arcs, then turning the grass to dry under the sun. You move through the fields in long lines. No machines, just muscle and rhythm. Your hands are raw and your arms ache, but it's work that connects everyone. Even gossip moves more freely in the hayfields. This is where news travels. Who's gotten sick? Who's had a child? Who was seen talking too long to someone else's daughter? Lunch, or dinner, as you still call the midday meal, is eaten in the field now. A cloth spread on the ground. Bread, cold pottage, hard cheese if you're lucky. The bread is brown and coarse, full of bran and small stones from imperfect grinding. Your teeth are worn down from it, but you barely notice. It's just what food is. You drink small beer, more nutritious than water and safer. And then, after resting a while in the tall grass, you go back to it. The sun is high and time is soft-edged. There's no precise way to measure it. You know the position of the sun and the feel of the shadows. Work continues until early evening, when the heat drops just enough that you can take stock of how much is left to do. Sometimes a local reeve comes by to make sure everyone is tending their strips of land. He's no lord, just another villager, appointed to ensure the system works. You don't particularly like him, but you tolerate him. The village can't run without someone doing that job. Now and then, a friar passes through the village. His brown robes are faded and patched, and his feet are bare. He speaks of sin and charity, of God's mercy, of hell's certainty, of saints who saw visions in cities that burned. He blesses your field, collects what coins people can spare, and moves on. You don't remember his name, but his presence lingers. You hope his blessing helps the barley grow straight. Some days you work in the Lord's field. On those days the grain is not yours, and neither is the satisfaction. These are known as boon days, days when you owe labor to the manor. It isn't theft, you remind yourself. It's just how the world works. The same system feeds your family and keeps some semblance of order in this part of the kingdom. If the Lord is harsh, the village grumbles. If he's lenient, you hope he doesn't die suddenly and get replaced by someone worse. Still, you notice how much of your time is not your own. There are tithes to pay to the church, rents to pay to the manor, days of work promised without compensation. You give your grain, your eggs, sometimes your hens. You feel the pinch when the weather is bad or when your children are sick, and you still must hand over your tenth. The tithe barn stands tall near the church. It always looks full. By mid-afternoon, the tasks begin to vary. Women and girls might fetch water, tend gardens, spin wool. Spinning never stops. Wool must be carded, twisted into thread, and then woven. You hear the dull whir of the spindle, even when you try to nap. If you're a weaver or a carpenter, by trade you return to your workshop. Tradesfolk live among peasants in the same villages, bound by the same rituals. You might make tools, a rake from ash wood, a bucket from staves. Everything is handmade, every object shaped by fingers, smoothed by use. Nothing is disposable. If a bucket leaks, it's fixed. If it cannot be fixed, it's repurposed. The idea of throwing away useful things would be incomprehensible. Even broken blades become hinges, bent nails are straightened, and fabric is patched until it disappears beneath the mending. One unexpected source of leisure is the communal oven. Not every household has one. Wood is too precious to waste on. Individual baking, so villagers often share. Once a week, you or your neighbor kneads coarse dough and takes it to the oven. The oven keeper watches it carefully and may take a portion of your bread as payment. Waiting for bread to bake is a rare window to talk. You swap news, recipes, insults, theories about when the rain will come. In summer, the village smells of dust and sweat, but also of yeast, manure, wood smoke, and hay. These are not unpleasant smells to you. They are just the background of life. You are used to grime. Bathing happens rarely, though you might splash water on your face or wash your hands in a stream. Clothes are worn until they fall apart and then resewn into something else. Cloth is more valuable than most people realize. If you're lucky, your village has a smith. The blacksmith is indispensable. He sharpens your tools, fixes hinges, nails horseshoes. The smithy is noisy and hot, filled with the clang of metal and the hiss of cooling iron. The work is loud, but the smith is respected. Fire is dangerous, and anyone who can master it earns their place. As evening comes on, animals are brought back in. Cows milked, chickens cooped, pigs tethered. If you have a pig, it's probably the most valuable thing you own. They eat scraps and grow fat quickly. If you kill it, the meat will be preserved in salt and you'll eat it in slices for months, carefully rationed. But more often, pigs are bartered or raised as payment for a debt. Ownership is rarely simple. You might raise a pig that belongs to your landlord. In exchange, you keep the offspring. You finish the day by locking your shed or coop, such as it is. Locks are primitive, mostly iron bars and wedges, but thieves are few. Everyone knows everyone. If something is stolen, it's found out quickly. Shame is a powerful tool of control. Before dark falls, the village priest might make his rounds. He stops to offer blessings or check on the sick. He knows your family by name, knows how many children you've lost, knows your habits. He isn't a man of great learning, but he can read a little Latin and perform mass. If there is a dispute, he may help settle it, especially if it threatens village peace. The final meal is called supper. It's smaller than dinner, more pottage, maybe a bit of curdled milk or lentils. The children are quieter now, the air cooler. Sometimes you hear music, a reed pipe, or a bowed fiddle. Songs are passed down orally. You don't write them down, but you remember them about saints, harvests, mischief, or just the weather. By twilight, the fields go quiet. Some go to the church to pray the evening prayers. Others sit outside watching the sky shift. No stars are named, except for the ones mentioned in sermons. But you know them well. You can tell the time by their position, feel the seasons in your bones. There are moments of laughter. Children chase fireflies. Adults sip the last of the ale. And someone recounts a tale of a cow that got loose and trampled the laundry. You laugh tiredly. It is not joy exactly, but a kind of warmth that comes from shared struggle. You sleep early again. The fire is low. You tuck your children in, and you wonder if the weather will hold. You wonder if the Lord will raise the rents. You wonder if this year's barley will sprout without blight. You wonder if your daughter will marry someone who treats her well. And you wonder, will anything ever change? The day draws to a close, not with a dramatic curtain fall, but with the slow, quiet routines of a medieval evening. It is not peaceful in the modern sense. There are still tasks to finish, aches to nurse, tools to store, and a fire to tend. But it is rhythmically calm. It is the kind of calm that comes not from leisure, but from inevitability. Things must be done because they always have been. No one questions why you turn the wheel or knead the dough. It is simply what is done. Your hands are tired. Your back tugs at you, reminding you of the labor behind the bread on the table. In wealthier households, like those of the reeve or the village blacksmith, there might be meat tonight, a small hen maybe, or rabbit if someone set a snare. But most of you eat the same as always. Pottage. It's thick with peas, cabbage, and some bitter herbs from the hedgerow. If it's summer, you add a few fresh leeks. If it's winter, you just chew and think of spring. The children don't complain. Much. Hunger is familiar. They know not to ask for more than there is. Some chew on the crusts of trencher bread, hard slabs that soak up the stew, sometimes shared between multiple people. It's not wasteful. Even the crusts are eaten or given to pigs if they're too hard for human teeth. The idea of leftovers does not exist. There is only food or no food. Outside, the light fades slowly. There are no clocks. Time is measured by chores. How many hours to milk? How long until you can no longer see the ridges in the furrows? Candlelight is rare. Tallow candles smell, and wax is too expensive for most. A bit of firelight will have to do. You stretch it as far as you can. That means sewing, spinning, or even reading aloud if someone has the skill. A few people in the village know how to read, but most do not. Reading is not a solitary activity. It's a communal event. If someone owns a book, usually a psalter or a saint's life, it is well thumbed and likely missing its original binding. Books are copied by hand, line by line, by monks or scribes in town. If your village is near, a monastery. Sometimes the monks walk among you, silent and hooded. They seem otherworldly, but they too have their chores. In the evenings, many gather for the final prayer of the day, Compline. It is led by the parish priest or, in small places, just a devout elder. You kneel in the damp church or under the open sky if it's warm. You recite Latin words you do not understand, but they comfort you in their repetition. Custodi nos, Domine, ut pupillum oculi. Protect us, Lord, as the apple of your eye. The meaning filters through anyway, like rain through old wool. Some villagers visit the graves behind the church. They whisper to the stones. The idea of a soul is simple to you. The body is buried in the earth. The soul goes to God, unless it does not. You've heard stories of purgatory, of ghosts, of wandering souls. You sprinkle holy water. You cross yourself. You do not linger too long. Most dwellings are dark now. Families huddle together under rough wool blankets, sometimes sleeping 4 or 5 to a bed for a warmth. Privacy does not exist. There is no shame in it. Bodies are simply bodies. You've given birth with neighbors watching. You've washed your father's corpse with your sister's help. You've seen your husband cry over a failed crop. There is no secrecy when life is this close and thin. In the richer manors, things are a little different. The Lord's family may have sheets, cushions, and a garderobe, a small drafty room built for relieving oneself. But even there, lice creep through bedding, and drafts make it hard to sleep. You know because your cousin works in the manor as a servant. She says they light a torch for the dog, not the servant. She doesn't resent it. That's just how things are. What passes for comfort comes not from luxury, but from familiarity. You know every sound in your house. The creak of the beam, the stirrings of your children, the faint rustle of mice in the thatch above. Your walls are daubed with clay and straw. They sweat when it rains. The roof sometimes leaks. When it storms, you pray. And when the wind is soft, you listen to it move over the fields and feel a strange kind of contentment. You are poor, but not alone. Stories are told at night. They're not fairy tales exactly. They're recollections, lessons, family lore. You pass them down without thinking about preservation. A story your grandmother told becomes your daughter's bedtime story. Sometimes it's about saints who stood in the snow until their toes turned black. Sometimes it's about the ox that kicked over the lantern and set the barn on fire. Sometimes it's about your own birth, a cold morning, a broken cart, a midwife, with hands like bark. You wonder quietly what stories will be told about you. In the winter, you sleep more. There is simply less to do. In the summer, you sleep less, wake early, and work longer. The sun controls everything. The moon, too. Women track it to understand their cycles. Men watch it for signs of luck. You know it not as a symbol of romance, but as a timekeeper. Dreams are vivid. They often feature animals, hunger, or weather. Some believe dreams carry divine messages. Others think they're just echoes of your day. Either way, you wake with them in your bones. Sometimes you try to tell someone, but there are too many chores to waste time on dreams. You bundle the thought away. Night watch is a task shared by those who live on the edges: shepherds, monks, the ill, or the unlucky. Wolves are not as common as they used to be, but they are still spoken of. Not many are seen. Still, the stories keep the children from wandering too far. Fires are kept small. Smoke is controlled. A flickering light might invite more than warmth. It might bring attention. The kind that comes on horseback, unannounced. Taxes come even at night. Not literally, but the anxiety of them. A king's war might feel far away, but it lands at your door in the form of a new levy, a census, a forced labor order. The 100 Years' War drags on in the background. Armies are somewhere, always marching. But you are here. You cannot read the proclamations nailed to the church door, but the reeve reads them to you and his voice sounds tired. And still, amid the constant motion of tasks, you notice small joys. A good harvest, a dry bed, a child's laughter, the first strawberries of summer. These are not grand victories, but they are real. You press them into memory like herbs between pages, quiet, fragile, enduring. The church bell might ring once more, a final reminder of God's gaze. Or perhaps not. Maybe it's broken. Maybe the ringer is ill. Either way, the sky is dark, and sleep is needed. As your breathing slows, you wonder not about glory or fame. Those are words for lords and kings, but about continuity. Will your grandchildren do these same things? Will your name be remembered? Or will you become one of the countless whose life passed like mist over the morning fields? The strange bureaucracy of Roman toilets and more. You're walking into a Roman city. Maybe Pompeii, maybe Londinium, or somewhere less remembered by modern maps, and before long you'll need to relieve yourself. You're not a senator or a slave, you're just someone ordinary. You worked the market, maybe swept a bathhouse floor, or followed your patron down the colonnades for half a day before the heat pushed you toward the shade. There is a place you can go, and that place is not hidden behind doors or tucked away in shame. It's public, it's made of stone, it's sociable, it's the Roman toilet. To our modern eyes, a Roman public latrine is both striking and odd. It looks like a meeting place that someone forgot to finish. Rows of smooth stone benches are set against the wall, each with keyhole-shaped holes carved into them. Underneath runs a shallow channel of water. A second gutter runs in front like a miniature stream at your feet. There are no cubicles, no stalls, no privacy. You sit where you find a spot and do what everyone else is doing. But here's where things get more curious. These places weren't just functional, they were managed. You couldn't just build a latrine and hope for the best. They were part of a deeply bureaucratic, almost ritualized system of urban hygiene. And behind this seemingly dull necessity was an entire chain of labor, supervision, engineering, and, yes, even taxes. To begin with, consider the engineering. Roman latrines were part of an elaborate infrastructure of aqueducts, sewers, and drain systems. These weren't slapped together in a hurry. The Cloaca Maxima, Rome's greatest sewer, began as an Etruscan drainage canal in the 6th century BCE and grew into a marvel that channeled runoff, stormwater, and human waste through the city. Its function was critical. If the cloaca failed, so did the city. But you might be surprised to learn that toilets weren't connected to every home. That luxury belonged to the elite. The average Roman, even in a city, relied on these communal spaces. Yet even in this, there was hierarchy. Some latrines were open access, attached to markets or bathhouses, while others were fee-based or attached to temples. Entry might cost a quadrans, the smallest Roman coin, though even this small fee might be waived for citizens under certain patronage. So who built these latrines? Who cleaned them? Who managed the water, the seating, the drains? That brings us to the real heart of Roman sanitation, the workers. First, there were the latrinales, low-ranking laborers tasked with scrubbing the benches, clearing the drains, and maintaining a semblance of order in a place where order was difficult to maintain. Their work was largely invisible, but critical. You could not allow excrement to sit in open trenches for long without risking both disease and divine disfavor. Next came the aquarii, those who controlled the water flow. A well-run latrine required constant water, to flush the sewer, to fill the lower channels, and to moisten the cleaning sponge, the tersorium. This sponge, mounted on a stick, was used communally. Dipped in vinegar or salt water between uses, it was passed along a row of patrons like a shared towel. A modern listener might shudder, but at the time, it was not a source of horror. It was simply how things were done. Above them all, there were aediles, elected officials responsible for public works, including sanitation. The edile didn't sweep latrines or unstick clogged drains, but they were responsible for making sure someone did. They issued orders, collected complaints, and allocated funds from the municipal coffers. Aediles were sometimes mocked in Roman literature for their obsession with minutiae, like regulating the height of urinals or the smell of drains, but these duties were vital for urban life. Rome's public image depended in part on its public toilets, but there's another layer to all this: the social aspect. Roman latrines weren't just a necessity, they were a scene. Men sat side by side, exchanging gossip, arguing about politics, sharing news from the baths or the games. Some latrines were elaborately decorated with mosaics, painted walls, and marble finishes. One surviving latrine inscription from Lepsis Magna offers a gentle reminder to be considerate. Friend, beware of doing harm where good men sit. Toilets were also, curiously, a place of fear, because they were entrances to the underworld in the Roman imagination. The dark openings beneath your body, the hollow gurgle of unseen waters, and the mists of decay all suggested something deeply supernatural. People believed that spirits, even demons, might emerge from toilets. To protect against this, some latrines featured carved faces, apotropaic symbols, to scare away evil. Others used magic spells scratched into the stone, invoking deities, like Fortuna or Mercury, to keep the underworld at bay. Even more mundane fears existed: rats, snakes, or insects crawling up from the dark. And so you'd go with caution. You might pray silently, or in some cases bring a charm. Fear and routine wove together like the fibers of a reed sponge. We often imagine Roman society as lavish and dignified, senators in white togas, orators, declaiming in the forum. But the latrine reminds us that this world also depended on systems of sweat and water, rot and management. That, behind every elegant mosaic, there was a man with a shovel, clearing muck before sunrise. That even emperors, for all their glory, still had to go somewhere. Speaking of emperors, there's one more odd fact. The Roman state taxed urine. Emperor Vespasian, ruling in the 1st century CE, introduced a tax on the collection of urine from public latrines. Why? Because urine had value. Fullers, those who cleaned and whitened wool, used the ammonia in urine to treat cloth. So collectors would harvest the liquid from urinals and sell it to the laundries. Vespasian saw a revenue stream. His son Titus mocked the idea, saying it was undignified. Vespasian famously held a coin under his son's nose and asked, "Does it smell?" When Titus said no, Vespasian replied, "Yet it comes from urine." From that moment came the phrase, pecunia non olet. Money does not stink. You may be thinking, what kind of empire collects its citizens' waste and taxes it? But to the Romans it made perfect sense. Waste was not just something to discard. It was part of the economy, part of the labor structure, and part of what made the city function. So the next time you imagine the grandeur of Rome, think not only of marble arches and eagle standards, but also of water flowing through channels, sponges in vinegar, and quiet conversations on stone benches. Because empires are not only built on conquest and laws, sometimes they are maintained one clean latrine at a time. And as you leave the latrine, adjusting your tunic, nodding to the latrinales, and stepping back into the dusty hum of the street, you might wonder, who cleaned all of this yesterday? And who will do it tomorrow? It is early morning in ancient Ostia, Rome's bustling port city. The sun has only just begun to creep over the tiled roofs, and already the air smells faintly of salt, smoke, and yesterday's olives. In one shadowy corner of the city, behind the grain market and not far from a wine shop, there is a modest, public latrine attached to a bathhouse. It looks like stone benches carved into a wall, nothing impressive, but it hums with an unspoken order. You wouldn't think twice about it. And yet, hours before a single citizen will sit on one of those cool benches, someone else has already been hard at work. His name is not recorded in any scroll or triumphal inscription. He is not remembered in marble or bronze, but he is there, with a cloth tied across his mouth, an oil lamp in one hand, and a short wooden shovel in the other. He's part of a class of laborers we might call foricari, those responsible for the care and maintenance of Rome's public latrines and sewers. The foricarius arrives just before dawn, when the stink of the day before has risen into the air, and the water flowing beneath the benches is clogged with detritus. With a quiet determination, he lowers himself into the stone pit where the drain meets the larger sewer. It is not glamorous work. It is not even work that people speak of aloud. But it is essential. A backed-up sewer could close an entire bathhouse or bring illness to a district. He scrapes, clears, pushes waste further downstream, and hopes that the Cloaca Maxima is doing its job beyond the city walls. And here's the strange thing. For all their invisibility in written history, the workers of Rome's sanitation system were part of a delicate social and bureaucratic ecosystem. Consider again the aediles, those city officials in charge of urban management. Their duties included not only road maintenance and market regulation, but also oversight of public hygiene. Aediles inspected latrines, ensured water flows were sufficient, responded to complaints, and approved the employment of sanitation crews. These duties may seem small next to the grandeur of Roman warfare or politics, but they were critical to a city's well-being. The aediles themselves relied on subordinate officials, liberti, or freedmen, who managed day-to-day operations as well as contract laborers like the foricari. In larger cities like Rome, Ostia, or Carthage, sanitation tasks could be subcontracted through guilds or syndicates. A sanitation syndicate might bid on maintaining a district's latrines, supply its own crew of laborers, and receive a monthly stipend from the municipal treasury. In essence, cleaning toilets was a privatized public service, tightly monitored and funded by the state. Wages were low, but the job was steady, and for many freedmen or lower-class Romans, stability mattered more than honor. Interestingly, we find occasional graffiti in the ruins of Roman latrines, some crude, others comedic, and a few surprisingly introspective. One scratched into the stone of a latrine in Pompeii reads, "Here I have sat and passed the time with friends. May Fortuna grant that I never fall in." It is tempting to laugh, but there's a truth buried in those lines. Even in a place as ignoble as a toilet, humans seek connection and grace. The daily rhythm of latrine life followed the city's broader tempo. Early mornings were busiest, followed by a lull in the hot midday hours, then another surge in the evening. In a well-run latrine, a latrinalis would be stationed with a bucket of vinegar water and a tray of tersoria, sponges on sticks. These were cleaned between uses, though not always thoroughly. Patrons might carry their own sponge or cloth, but many simply used the communal supply, dipping it in the water channel that flowed at their feet. The front water channel, incidentally, served multiple purposes. While one stream carried waste away under the benches, the front channel provided water for washing, sponge dipping, and even hand cleansing. In higher-end latrines, the water might flow from a small fountainhead, adorned with a carved nymph or satyr. These design touches were not just decorative, they were meant to keep patrons from forgetting they lived in a city of order, beauty, and Roman virtue, even while relieving themselves. It is worth noting, too, that latrines were largely a male space. Roman public toilets were almost exclusively used by men. Women often had access only through private facilities in homes or designated sections of bathhouses. The absence of female presence in most surviving latrines has led historians to debate the gendered structure of Roman sanitation. Did women carry chamber pots? Did they avoid public relief entirely? Or were there simply fewer public accommodations for them? The truth likely varied city by city, class by class. Still, it is a reminder that even in sanitation, the empire observed its hierarchies. Now let's return to the sewers themselves. The Cloaca Maxima, Rome's legendary sewer, began as an Etruscan waterway and eventually evolved into a vital artery beneath the city. It ran through Rome like a second invisible river, swallowing runoff, waste, and rainwater before emptying into the Tiber. Maintaining it was no small task. Workers descended into its tunnels with torches, clearing blockages, shoring up walls, and checking the flow. It was dangerous, filthy work, but not entirely without honor. Some accounts suggest that sewer workers participated in religious rituals, cleansing themselves after entering the underworld. In fact, the lustratio urbis, a purification ritual of the city, included symbolic gestures toward these subterranean spaces. The Romans, as ever, tied religion to reality. A sewer might be sacred. A toilet might require divine appeasement. Speaking of divinity, one cannot forget the odd gods of Roman sanitation. Chief among them was Cloacina, the goddess of the Cloaca Maxima. Originally a minor Etruscan deity, she was later Romanized and given a small shrine near the Forum. Cloacina was not a powerful goddess. She had no grand myths, no temples larger than a garden shed, but her presence reminds us that the Romans gave spiritual meaning to infrastructure. Even waste had a patron. Another sanitation deity, Stercutus, from stercus, meaning dung, was associated with fertilization and rural manure, but his legacy also extended into urban waste management. These deities were not worshipped with grandeur, but their names were whispered when things went wrong. A blocked sewer, a flooded latrine, a sudden illness. These might all be signs that Cloacina had been offended. This interweaving of bureaucracy, labor, and ritual formed the strange web of Roman sanitation. And like many aspects of Roman life, it was both impressive and inefficient. The system worked, but only just. In dry months, the water channels might stop flowing. In flood season, toilets might back up. And in crowded districts, latrines were few and far between, forcing people to improvise. One such improvisation, chamber pots or matulae. Carried by individuals or kept in bedrooms, these small vessels were emptied into cesspits, or more frequently, thrown out windows. Though illegal, this practice was widespread. A law in Rome prohibited the dumping of waste from windows without warning. So a cry of "cave, watch out," was required before tipping the contents of a pot into the alley below. City dwellers quickly learned to hug the walls and tread carefully after dark. Despite these risks and occasional chaos, the Roman sanitation system remained remarkably resilient. Inscriptions from small towns in Gaul and Hispania show municipal funding set aside for latrine upkeep. Civic pride was tied to cleanliness. A clean city was a Roman city. And a Roman city required more than marble temples and triumphal arches. It needed working sewers, steady water, and people willing to clean the unclean. And that brings us back to the Foricarius, the man with the oil lamp and shovel. His shift is nearly done. The sun is climbing and the street is coming alive with carts, cries, and sandals on stone. He climbs out of the pit, wipes his hands, and blends back into the crowd. No one thanks him. No one sees him. But the latrine is ready. And for today, that is enough. Tomorrow he will return. And perhaps if the drains don't back up, if the water flows, if no one scrawls crude graffiti in wet plaster, it will be a good day. But one can't help but wonder, what happened to all this knowledge? All this routine, when the empire began to crumble? It is easy to imagine that Rome fell all at once. A dramatic sacking, fires in the Forum, barbarians at the gates. But like most things in history, the end was slower, messier, and strangely quiet in places. And so it went with the Roman sewer. By the late 4th century, the infrastructure that had once defined the pride of Roman cities was already straining. Roads crumbled, aqueducts cracked, and the toilets, those humble marvels of engineering, began to fail in the most telling of ways. In many Roman cities, especially in the West, the fall of the empire didn't mean a sudden collapse of plumbing. The Cloaca Maxima, for example, kept working long after the emperors stopped issuing edicts. It was a passive system, gravity-driven, and many of its channels continued to carry waste out to the Tiber for centuries. But it is one thing to inherit a system. It is another to maintain it. What was lost wasn't just stone and water, but institutional memory. The bureaucrats who once inspected flow rates or contracted maintenance workers faded from the picture. The aediles, once central to urban function, had no role in the new Christian order. Bishops did not tour sewer lines. Monastic scribes rarely recorded the activities of latrine workers. And so the routine upkeep, the men with shovels, the vinegar buckets, the sponge maintenance, fell into neglect. It was in the smaller towns that the signs first appeared. Latrines grew clogged and were not cleared. Rainwater pools remained stagnant. Walls were patched poorly or not at all. A toilet without maintenance quickly becomes unusable, so chamber pots returned. Waste was tossed in alleys. Cesspits became the new norm. By the 6th century, the public toilet, once a staple of Roman dignity, had all but vanished in many corners of the West. Interestingly, however, this wasn't true everywhere. In Constantinople, the Eastern Roman, or Byzantine Empire, preserved far more of the Roman legacy. Their sewers were maintained, their aqueducts repaired. The great cisterns of the city, like the Basilica cistern, supplied water to both palaces and public fountains. Toilets, though more private, continued to be incorporated into homes, baths, and monasteries. Even in medieval times, records survive of plumbing inspections, fines for improper waste disposal, and the construction of new waste channels. Meanwhile, in places like Ravenna, Trier, and Carthage, the infrastructure decayed more slowly. In these regions, Romanized populations held on to the habits of urban sanitation. Latin inscriptions from the early medieval period still reference sewer grates and water rights. But in much of Europe, especially in former Roman Britain and Gaul, the knowledge of sewer maintenance faded into obscurity. Without public sanitation, the consequences were predictable: disease, odor, and discomfort. Cities shrank. Urban populations declined. People moved to the countryside where waste could be buried or absorbed into the soil. Latrines became simple holes, often shared with animals, and sometimes built above pigsties to allow natural disposal. For centuries, sanitation returned to the most basic systems: chamber pots, ditches, and manure piles. The medieval world inherited the land but not the blueprints. One curious exception, however, comes from the monasteries. In the isolated, ordered world of the medieval cloister, monks built systems of quiet ingenuity. The Rievaulx Abbey in England, for example, constructed a sophisticated sanitation system involving flowing water beneath the latrines. The plan of St. Gall, a 9th century architectural diagram of an ideal Benedictine monastery, includes detailed layouts for waste removal. Latrines were placed over small streams or engineered channels, mimicking Roman techniques, though without their scale or permanence. Here, in silence and script, some fragment of Roman plumbing survived, not in grand cities, but in the care of monks who saw cleanliness as a spiritual duty. But it would take the rediscovery of ancient texts and archaeological wonder to reignite a fascination with Roman sanitation. During the Renaissance, scholars studying Vitruvius, the Roman architect and engineer, began to marvel at the technical detail in his descriptions of aqueducts and drains. Engineers in Florence and Rome sought to recreate aspects of Roman hydraulics. Still, toilets remained primitive for centuries. In fact, the reintroduction of indoor plumbing to the general public would not occur until the 19th century. When it finally did, Rome again became a model, though indirectly. The Victorian fascination with classical antiquity led to renewed respect for ancient cleanliness. Engineers studied the gradients of Roman sewer slopes, the brickwork of aqueducts, and even the layout of latrines for ideas. The great underground sewer system of London, for example, constructed in the 1860s under engineer Joseph Bazalgette, was inspired in part by the passive flow principles used in ancient Rome. By then, historians had also begun to reinterpret Roman sanitation not as crude or barbaric, but as advanced, perhaps even enviable. The sponge on a stick may have provoked Victorian disgust, but the flowing water, tiled floors, and cooperative cleaning now seemed remarkably progressive. In museums today, you can find fragments of Roman toilets, carved stone seats, terracotta pipes, and small sponge holders. In Pompeii, entire latrines remain intact, frozen in time by ash. At Ostia, the benches still face one another in a U-shape, social, open, oddly democratic. The walls carry the faint scratchings of those who waited their turn. It is these spaces that tell us something more profound, that history is not only about kings and wars, but also about the small rituals of daily life. The things we do without thinking, washing hands, relieving ourselves, avoiding filth, are deeply historical acts. They shape cities, laws, and even religion, and they require maintenance. Quiet, unseen, thankless maintenance. If the story of the Roman toilet teaches us anything, it's that infrastructure is not self-sustaining. Even the best engineered sewer will clog without human effort. Even the most elegant bathhouse becomes useless without water, scrub brushes, and someone with a shovel. And yet, what a marvel it was, that an empire so vast, so chaotic, could coordinate the simple need of so many people to relieve themselves in comfort, that slaves, freedmen, officials, and engineers all played a role in this process, that even in decline, some remnants of that system endured, hidden in the work of monks revived by Renaissance architects and echoed in modern plumbing today. So the next time you flush a toilet, spare a thought for the laborers beneath the latrines, those invisible Romans who spent their lives scraping, sweeping, and scooping to keep the empire clean. Because in the end, what truly collapses a civilization? Is it the invasion of armies? Or the slow, silent failure of the things no one notices until they're gone? The secret lives of medieval bakers. You wake up in a medieval town. It's still dark. The sky hangs low with pre-dawn mist, and the streets are silent, save for the faint echo of footsteps headed toward the communal oven. Before the priests have risen for morning prayer, before the market stalls are opened or the bells ring from the town gate, someone is already at work, sleeves rolled, hands caked with flour, the baker. In many ways, the story of medieval bread is the story of life itself. It was the backbone of every meal, rich or poor. Bread accompanied every bowl of pottage, was used to soak up stew, to carry meat, to thicken ale. It filled the stomach and dulled the edge of constant hunger. And so the people who made bread, the millers, the kneaders, the fire tenders, held, quite literally, the lives of the community in their hands. The baker's work began when most were still dreaming. Grain from the previous year's harvest had already been milled into flour, usually at a local watermill or windmill, both of which were typically controlled by the local lord or monastery. Milling was no trivial task. It involved long labor, heavy stones, and a feudal tax structure. A portion of the flour, known as multure, was always taken by the miller as payment. Once the flour was secured, often stored in wooden barrels or linen sacks to avoid dampness and rats, the baker would begin the day's work. Mixing dough was a physical act. There were no metal mixers, no powered kneaders. It was done by hand in large troughs, often made of oak or elm, and frequently shared among baking families in villages or guilds in towns. Yeast, when used, came not from neat little packets, but from sourdough starters or the froth collected from ale brews, brewer's yeast, which gave medieval bread a tangy, unpredictable quality. In some places, barm, the yeasty foam skimmed off beer during fermentation, was so prized that brewers and bakers maintained tight partnerships. When others' bread was unleavened, dense, and dark, the type of bread one ate reflected one's station. Rye and barley loaves were common among peasants, hard, chewy, often coarse and flecked with bits of husk or straw. Maslin, a mixture of wheat and rye, was cheaper and more accessible than pure wheat. The soft, white manchet loaves were for the wealthy, refined and expensive, made with the finest sifted wheat and often flavored with milk or eggs. But the distinction wasn't just about taste. It was about survival. Peasants might go weeks or months without meat or vegetables in winter, but bread was constant. And so, any disruption to its production, bad harvests, grain taxes, spoilage, could send entire communities into panic. The Siu. Baker, therefore, was both essential and vulnerable. In cities, bakers were part of tight-knit guilds, regulated by law, supervised by market officials. Their weights were measured, their ovens inspected. Prices for loaves were often set by decree, and cheating, whether by shorting weight or cutting quality, was met with harsh punishment. In London, dishonest bakers could be pilloried, their bread dumped into the street, and their reputations ruined. In smaller towns and villages, things were even more precarious. Bakers operated communal ovens, sometimes charging a small fee to neighbors who brought their own dough. These ovens were massive, stone chambers heated by roaring fires, scraped clean before the bread was loaded on long wooden peels. Once the bread was baked, the baker might deliver it to individual homes, or it would be picked up, often marked with a distinctive family seal to prevent confusion. Of course, mistakes happened. Bread was burned, loaves were mixed. Accusations of theft or deception could erupt into real anger. Bread riots were not uncommon in medieval Europe. If a baker raised prices after a bad harvest, or if the bread was found to be too light or too heavy, or if mold spread through a village's batch, tensions could rise quickly. In fact, bread was so vital that towns employed bread weighers or assize officials, local authorities tasked with ensuring that loaves met legal standards. The assize of bread and ale, established in 13th century England, was one of the earliest examples of consumer protection law. Bakers who violated it were subject to fines, forfeiture, and, in some cases, public humiliation. But not all bakers were scoundrels or saints. They were, as ever, human. In town records from Bruges to York to Florence, you'll find their names: Thomas the Baker, Elena de Pan, Guido Fornarius, alongside minor infractions: baking with adulterated flour, selling yesterday's loaves, overcharging widows. You'll also find evidence of quiet charity, giving extra loaves to the church, feeding the hungry during Lent, or baking symbolic breads for feast days. Medieval bakers lived with flour in their lungs and fire on their skin. They were often burned, dust-choked, overworked. In winter, they labored in freezing conditions. In summer, they sweated beside ovens hot enough to blister tile. Yet many passed their craft on to sons and daughters. In some towns, women were allowed to bake, publicly, especially widows who inherited their husbands' licenses. Children grew up learning the feel of dough underhand, the patience of rising bread, the timing of a properly fired oven. It was an art passed by muscle memory, not books. Recipes were rarely written down. Bread was known by feel, by how it stuck to the hand, how it cracked when tapped, how it smelled when done. And yet, for all their essential role, bakers were often looked down upon. Perhaps it was envy of their importance or suspicion bred by necessity. In medieval humor and literature, the baker is sometimes mocked, seen as a cheat, a miser, a greedy middleman who profits off hunger. In the Canterbury Tales, Chaucer's, Cook remarks that bread is often covered in flour to hide its age, a wry nod to the tricks of the trade. Still, the baker remained essential. During plague years, when markets closed and panic gripped cities, bakers were among the few still moving. Some risked their lives to keep ovens going. Others were accused of spreading illness through infected flour. When fire consumed London in 1666, it famously began in the shop of a baker, Thomas Farriner, though the story is more complicated than legend suggests. In times of peace and famine alike, the baker's schedule remained brutally regular. Wake before dawn, light the fire, mix the dough, knead, wait, shape, bake, repeat, all while watching for signs of spoilage, ash in the fire, cracks in the oven. Every mistake could ruin the day's work. Every decision, how much water to use, when to close the door, whether the flour had turned, carried weight. They worked with perishables, and yet their labor fed thousands. In churches, bread became sacred. In daily life, it was survival. In tax ledgers, it was counted. In fairy tales, it was stolen or gifted or enchanted. But always, it was there. And so the baker, sweaty, silent, sleep-deprived, remained the anchor of the medieval meal. The invisible architect of hunger and satiety. But what happened when the harvest failed? When the grain ran out? When desperation pushed people to make bread out of acorns or sawdust or chalk? What did the baker do then? The famine years were different. You could smell it in the village before you saw it. A sour, damp odor hung in the air, not of decay exactly, but of desperation. People moved slower. The baker's shop, once bustling before dawn, had fewer customers now. Those who still came clutched coins tighter, asked quieter questions, and left with smaller loaves. When the harvest failed, as it often did in medieval Europe, life didn't just get harder. It entered a state of barely contained crisis. Gathering was so central to daily survival that grain prices dictated everything. One poor summer of rainfall, or one hard spring frost, and the consequences rippled across the entire social web. Markets dried up, bakeries closed, and hunger turned to anger. The baker, caught in the middle, had choices, none of them easy. Some tried to stretch flour supplies by using extenders, crushed beans, peas, oats, or bran. Others resorted to substitutes that danced dangerously close to poison. Milled chestnuts, acorns, bark, even powdered limestone or chalk. In the worst years, historical records from France, England, and parts of Germany mention famine bread, a bitter, gray, barely edible substance that left the eater sick but marginally fuller. But what else could a baker do when no flour was available? Turning away customers meant turning away neighbors, friends, and sometimes family. And yet, selling adulterated bread risked fines, ruin, or worse. The authorities weren't forgiving, even in lean years. The assize of bread didn't flex with the weather. If the law said a loaf must weigh a certain amount for a fixed price, that was final. Shorten the weight, and you could end up in the stocks. Many bakers tried to survive by forming cooperative arrangements. In rural England and France, for example, small groups of villagers would pool flour and ingredients. The baker, often the only one with a proper oven, would produce communal loaves, each marked with the symbol of the family who owned the dough. This system preserved bread making when wheat became scarce. But it also meant the baker was responsible for safeguarding a community's only food. There were moments of collective strength during these years, neighbors helping neighbors, churches distributing bread during holy days, monasteries opening their larders. In fact, monastic bakeries were often better stocked than village ones. They had better grain stores, larger ovens, and well-trained labor. In some towns, the abbey's oven became the fallback for all, but it couldn't last forever. By the 14th century, the Great Famine of 1315-1317 brought the issue to the surface. Constant rain ruined crops across northern Europe. Grain could not ripen. Horses drowned in muddy fields. Food stores began to rot. And bakers, no matter how committed, couldn't conjure wheat from empty barns. Contemporary chronicles from this period describe lines forming outside bakeries before dawn. Long, silent, shivering queues of townspeople hoping for even a crumb. Sometimes the baker would emerge empty-handed, explaining in a low voice that nothing had come from the mill, or that the Lord had seized the last sacks of grain. Other times he would sell only a few loaves to avoid a riot. And when riots came, bakers were often the first targets. In Paris, Bruges, and parts of England, historical court rolls describe citizens breaking into bakeries and stealing loaves, only to be caught and punished. But equally, they showed desperate bakers trying to hide their wares, bake at night, or even bury flour to protect it from looters. In Florence, one baker was dragged from his shop for allegedly hoarding flour. His shop was ransacked, his oven shattered. The link between bread and civil unrest is not just poetic. It was economic reality. The idea that bread is peace existed long before the French Revolution. For medieval people, it was an article of faith. Yet in these same records, we find glimpses of resilience. Bakers making soup with broken bread and selling it for a single coin. Bread baked with peas and lentils made free for children under 10. In the village of Rivol, a monk baker's journal speaks of staying awake 3 nights straight to bake flat loaves for pilgrims arriving in the middle of Lent. In times of collapse, bakers became not just laborers but lifelines. But famine wasn't the only danger to their trade. Fire was another. Medieval ovens were massive, hot, and temperamental. A spark from a chimney could engulf an entire wooden neighborhood. Bakers had to constantly monitor heat levels. Too hot, and the bread would burn. Too cold, and it would collapse. Ovens were preheated with kindling for hours, then scraped and sealed with loaves inside, often based on nothing more than the baker's instinct and experience. There were no thermometers. Bakers learned heat by holding a hand inside the oven, mouth or watching the color of soot on the walls. They knew by the way steam rose from the dough, whether the bread would survive or turn soggy. This was muscle memory, passed down from one baker to the next. In wealthier towns, baking became more centralized. There, the bakehouse might serve dozens of families. It was often overseen by a master baker and his apprentices, who lived above the ovens or in nearby quarters. Apprenticeship was long, sometimes 7 years, and harsh. Early mornings, burns, calloused hands. But for the boy who learned well, a steady living could await. In cities like London or Paris, bakers could eventually become wealthy guild members. These were tightly regulated clubs with their own rituals, patron saints like Saint Honoré, and considerable political sway. They dictated who could bake, what recipes could be used, and even set price standards. For a baker lucky enough to be born in a city, the guild was protection. For the rural baker, such prestige was often out of reach. Interestingly, the daily work of a baker in a village barely differed from that of one in a castle. Nobles had better ovens and higher quality flour, yes, but they still relied on trained bakers to manage their kitchens. Some bakers were even employed full-time in noble households, baking elaborate breads not for sustenance but for status. These included braided loaves, sweetened with honey, or shaped into birds and flowers for feast day displays. Bread took on a symbolic role in aristocratic life. White, soft bread meant purity and rank. It was served on silver platters and thrown out if it grew stale. Meanwhile, just miles away, peasants ate crusts baked with crushed legumes and shared it among 6. Still, even with all this inequality, there was a shared language in bread. It connected people, through feast days and fasts, through famine and abundance, through Sunday dinners and Lenten sacrifices. You might loathe your Lord, but you likely ate the same grain. Toward the end of the 14th century, innovations began to creep in. Brick ovens became more common. Some bakers experimented with dried yeast cultures, others with different grains depending on climate. In parts of Germany and the Low Countries, rye bread became dominant. In Italy, where wheat grew more easily, softer white breads were preferred. But nothing changed the fact that being a baker was dangerous, humbling, and physically punishing work. Every night as others slept, the baker watched the dough rise. Every day as the loaves disappeared into open mouths, the cycle began again, and the cycle rarely paused even for death. In plague years, especially during the Black Death, many bakers succumbed to illness. The tight quarters, ash-filled lungs, and constant public contact made them vulnerable. Some tried baking with cloths over their mouths. Others fled cities entirely. A few left behind baking journals, scraps of parchment detailing recipes, daily routines, or simply notes on flour supplies. From these, we catch fleeting images of people who never made it into history books. Agnes, who baked 5 loaves a day for the local church. Tommaso, who bartered loaves for candles. Isolde, who taught her niece how to test heat by listening to the wood crackle. Their names fade into obscurity, but their labor lives on in the Yaude, crusts and crumbs of forgotten tables. But what happened when the economy finally shifted? When new grains, ovens, and trade routes began to change bread forever? What role did the medieval baker play as the world moved toward modernity? You awaken before the cock crows. The stars still linger outside the bakery window, suspended in a sky slowly preparing to lighten. There's no clock to chime, no electric hum to ease you into your labor. Just the hush of sleeping village roofs and the quiet weight of responsibility. The dough must be ready before sunrise and the oven must already be warming. This final section brings us to the long arc of transformation that medieval baking underwent during the transition toward the early modern world. A change not sudden, but quietly unfolding over centuries as empires rose and trade routes expanded. And with it, bakers, those humble, flour-dusted workers of heat and grain, began to find themselves in a shifting world where bread, once local and sacred, became industrial and commodified. Let us begin with the dawn of new ingredients. The Columbian Exchange, triggered by European contact with the Americas in the late 15th and early 16th centuries, brought with it corn, potatoes, and new forms of sugar. While these did not immediately replace bread, they gradually altered the diets of Europe's poor, supplementing grain shortages with alternate sources of carbohydrates. Bakers, especially those in the southern European regions, began experimenting, cautiously. Cornbread took root in northern Italy. Sweetbreads and pastries, thanks to access to New World. Sugar emerged as popular festival items in France and Spain. But long before industrialization mechanized flour milling or gave rise to standardized white bread, one major factor had already begun to change everything: the mill. The medieval baker's fate was deeply tied to the local miller. In fact, in many villages, the miller had more control over bread than the baker did. Without flour, there could be no bread, and millers controlled both price and quality. Lords often owned the local mills and required their serfs to grind grain there for a fee. Bakers, in turn, were required to buy from that same source. This created a tightly regulated cycle. The farmer grew the wheat, the lord owned the field, and mill? The miller ground the flour and the baker turned it into bread. Everyone along the way took a cut, except perhaps the baker, who often worked on the thinnest margin. Over time, resentment toward millers grew. Folk tales and poems from the 14th and 15th centuries often depict millers as greedy or dishonest, measuring flour dishonestly, wetting grain to increase its weight, or charging illegal tolls. Chaucer's The Reeve's Tale features a miller who cheats college students out of flour, hardly a flattering portrait. And yet the baker, rarely the villain, remained a symbol of trust and sustenance, even when bread was scarce. Still, the dependence on the miller system left bakers vulnerable. When mills were flooded or burned, when lords increased tolls or grain supplies dried up, bakers had no recourse. Some turned to black market grain dealers. Others resorted to smuggling or baking in secret. In towns like Ghent and Bruges, where baker guilds were strong, this underground trade was especially active during famine years. Guilds themselves deserve a closer look. While some were notoriously rigid, they also provided structure and community. A baker's guild might oversee training, enforce recipe standards, inspect loaves for purity, and even offer assistance in times of illness or financial hardship. Membership could be expensive, but for city bakers it meant legal protection and social legitimacy. Guild rules could be exacting. Bread had to be baked at certain temperatures, weighed precisely, and even marked with a unique stamp or seal. Violations such as underweight loaves or adulterated flour were punished severely. Fines, public shaming, and even expulsion were common. The guild also defined your identity. A master baker wore specific clothing, might live above the bakehouse, and often held a respected place in religious and civic events. On feast days, bakers might lead processions, bake symbolic loaves, or provide free bread to the poor, acts of both charity and social performance. Yet outside the guild walls, in rural places untouched by regulation, baking retained its deeply personal, even mystical character. Superstitions lingered. In some parts of Eastern Europe, bakers recited prayers before lighting the oven. In German folklore, it was bad luck to whistle near rising dough. In parts of Ireland, newlyweds were gifted a soul loaf to eat together on their wedding night. Bread wasn't just food. It was ritual, protection, memory, and sometimes even rebellion. As urban populations grew and the cost of grain fluctuated, protests over bread erupted with increasing regularity. In 1529, a series of bread riots swept through the German states. In 1647, in Naples, a baker's refusal to reduce bread prices despite famine led to a full-blown revolt. Across Europe, the cry of "Give us bread" was no longer just a plea. It became political. Yet through all of this, the baker continued to rise in the middle of the night, knead in silence, and wait beside the fire. With the rise of cities, like Amsterdam, Paris, and London in the 17th and 18th centuries, bakery shops grew more specialized. You could now buy pain d'épices in Dijon, soft milk loaves in England, or black rye rolls in Baltic markets. Bread became less universal, more regional, and as social classes hardened, bread became a symbol of identity. The poor ate coarse, brown loaves. The wealthy dined on white bleached rolls, an early precursor to today's processed bread divide. The Industrial Revolution did more to sever the bond between baker and bread than any war or famine. By the late 18th century, steam-powered mills flooded the market with fine flour. Mechanized kneaders replaced hand labor. Chemical leavening, eventually culminating in modern commercial yeast, allowed for faster, more uniform loaves. By the mid-19th century, the first factory bakeries began appearing in England. The village baker, with his open fire and hand-formed dough, began to vanish. Bread lost its personal connection and became a product, cheaper, faster, more efficient, and yet oddly more distant. And yet, even today, traces of the medieval baker remain. You can still find wood-fired ovens in French countryside towns where a baker sweeps ash from stone and tests dough with his bare hands. You can still hear the creak of old bakery doors in Belgian villages, where the scent of rising yeast clings to brick walls centuries old. You can still taste the bitter, coarse bread of black rye in Eastern Europe, a recipe not far removed from what peasants ate during Lent 1,000 years ago. In recent decades, artisanal bread making has seen a revival. Sourdough starters passed from generation to generation, ancient grains grown with care, slow fermentation times that echo the rhythms of a time before convenience. The baker is once again a craftsman, but the past lingers in flour dust and muscle, memory. The kneading, the heat, the timing. Those haven't changed much since a medieval woman in a wool tunic pushed her dough into a stone oven, hoping for a crust that would last the week. She may have been invisible to history, but her hands shaped something we still recognize. In the end, The story of the medieval baker is not just about survival or economics. It is about attention, repetition, and care. It is about labor done, without glory. It is about waking in the dark to feed people you may never see. It is about creating something simple and profound out of grain, water, fire, and time. And maybe that is what makes it worth remembering. So the next time you tear a piece of bread, pause for a moment. Somewhere, in the long corridor of human time, a baker's shadow kneels by an oven listening to the crackle of flame. Would they recognize the loaf in your hand? Would they understand the world you live in? Or would they simply nod, knowing that after all these centuries you are still eating their work?